We need to talk about the Straw Hats and why your memory of them is lying to you. You think you remember their pain, but you don't. You remember Gear 5 cracking the sky, Zoro saying nothing happened, Robin screaming I want to live with the flag burning behind her. You remember the AMV moments, the highlight reel. The problem is, your brain keeps skipping the ugly, pathetic, humiliating in-between panels that actually built those scenes in the first place. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you picture Luffy at Marineford, do you see him foaming at the mouth, catatonic, begging for Ace not to die? Or do you just see the cool shot of him clashing with the admirals? When you think nothing happened, do you see Zoro crawling, shaking, bleeding out on his knees in front of Mihawk back at Barity? Or just the stoic silhouette in the fog on Thriller Bark? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because here's the thing. The Straw Hats are not legendary because of their victories. They are legendary because of the scenes where they completely fall apart and have nothing cool left. No speeches, no poses, no memeable one-liners. Just Luffy punching the ground and sobbing that he couldn't protect a single one of his crew. Just Nami stabbing her own shoulder over and over because she can't carve Arlong's mark out of her skin. Just Sanji on the Barati floor, face in the dirt, begging Zeph not to throw away the restaurant he loves more than himself. And Oda does this on purpose. He doesn't just allow them to fail, he drags them to emotional rock bottom and then quietly builds their future strength out of that rubble. Sabayodi isn't the arc where they lose. It's the operating system update that forces Luffy to realize, I can't do this alone, and go train for 2 years. Usopp running away at Water 7 isn't a gag. It's the prototype for his later courage, calibrated against the memory of his own cowardice. When you line those panels up, you see a pattern. Breakdown, then redesign. Listen to me. If you only track power-ups and wins, you are literally missing the core software of this crew. You see Gear 5 as a cool weapon, but you don't connect it back to the boy who failed to save Ace and decided he needed to be a different kind of captain. You cheer for Demon-back Zoro, but you ignore the humiliation of being one-shotted by Mihawk in front of his future captain. You love Robin's I want to live, but forget 20 years of being hunted as a living crime for knowing the ancient history. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to run an autopsy on every Straw Hat's worst moment. The exact scene where they break, the shame they choke on, the grief they can't swallow, and how Oda quietly rewires them afterward. Not because I am smarter than you, but because once you see how Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, Robin, Franky, Brook and Jinbe metabolize helplessness into resolve, you understand why this ship never sinks, even when its captain does. You're remembering One Piece wrong, and it's not your fault. And here's where I need you to be very honest with me for a second. The way you remember One Piece is probably a highlight reel the internet built for you. Not because you're lazy, but because the fandom trained your brain to only bookmark the W's. Gear 5 splash panels, Zoro with the bandana, Nami post Arlong with the tattoo slashed, Robin screaming she wants to live, but only the frame where she looks triumphant, not the pages where her teeth are chattering. We've all marinated in the same ecosystem. Power scaling debates, tier lists, who solos verse threads, meme panels of Luffy one-shotting people with conquerors. You scroll through peak fiction edits, and every Straw Hat is reduced to their 5 coolest screenshots and a dramatic AMV track. Zoro is a walking wallpaper. Sanji is just cigarette, lighter, kick, repeat. Usopp is God with a sniper pose, not the guy ugly crying behind a mask because he doesn't think he deserves to be on the ship. Here's the thing. Those community artifacts are biased as hell. AMVs, TikToks, Twitter threads, those respect compilations on YouTube. They all quietly crop out the bad vibes. You don't see Luffy catatonic after Marineford, staring at the sky and saying he couldn't protect a single one of them. You don't see Sanji on his knees in whole cake, begging, with his face swollen and his self-worth in the gutter. You don't see Usopp being pathetic at Water 7, screaming at Luffy about the going merry because he's projecting every insecurity he has onto a broken ship. And I say that with love, because my brain does the same thing. It wants the clean narrative where the Pirate King candidate is always grinning, where Zoro never doubts, where Robin's "I want to live" is a badass slogan instead of a breakdown built on 20 years of being hunted for existing with forbidden history in her head. It's easier to stand the poster than the person. But when you line those panels up, the canon is screaming something way harsher. This story is obsessed with losing, breaking, and begging. Luffy fails at Sabaody so catastrophically, he literally loses his entire crew in front of him. Zoro's whole identity gets annihilated by Mihawk at Baratie before he ever becomes the right hand. Sanji doesn't become cooler because he kicks harder. He becomes real when he admits he's a wounded kid from an abusive family who thinks he's disposable. Listen to me. This victory-only reading we all participate in. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda has said he likes drawing characters at their lowest first, then showing how they climb back up. That means the rock bottom isn't a detour, it's the blueprint. So if we take the canon seriously, we have to stop treating the crew's worst days as embarrassing footnotes. Those scenes are the main road. The ancient weapon-grade emotional infrastructure of One Piece is built on those collapses. In the next section, I want to walk you through each Straw Hat's worst moment and show you how Oda quietly flips it into the exact reason they're allowed on the Pirate King's ship at all. Confession time. I've reread your favorite meltdowns 20 times. So before we go marching through everybody's trauma like a tour group with binoculars, I need to confess something deeply unflattering about my brain. I have rewatched Luffy's Marineford breakdown more times than I have rewatched Gear 5. Not the punches, not the war. Just that boy on the ground, screaming that he couldn't save a single one of them. Same with Usopp versus Luffy. Same with Sanji face down in the rain in Whole Cake, begging Luffy to leave. You have your favorite hype moments. I have my favorite nervous breakdowns. And I say that with love, because if you're still here, your YouTube history is not clean either. Here's the thing. I don't just re-watch the big scenes. I go scavenging. Chapter spreads where Oda hides one Straw Hat turned away from the group. SBS comments where he casually explains why someone's gag actually comes from childhood shame. Tiny reaction panels during a brawl, the background dialogue you only notice on the fourth reread. When you line those panels up, the random meltdown starts looking like the most over-determined event in the story. We need to talk about how Oda builds that. He doesn't just wake up one morning and decide, okay, today Sanji cries in a puddle. He plants emotional foreshadowing the way he plants Void Sentry clues. A throwaway joke about Usopp lying becomes a full-blown identity crisis at Water 7. A single panel of Robin flinching at the word history blooms into Enies' lobby. This is the same guy who can make an ancient weapon plotline pay off 500 chapters later. You really think he treats Nami's breakdown as disposable? Now, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. I am not doing this because I am a guru with the true reading. I'm doing this because my brain is broken in a very specific pattern-seeking way, and Oda keeps feeding it. I'm obsessed with how he scaffolds failure, shame, and grief into later growth. Not because I am smarter than you, but because I care way more about the hinge points than the feats. So my method for this video is simple. Every worst moment is a door hinge. Before, what rule for living does that Straw Hat walk in with? If I'm strong enough, nobody dies. If I'm useful, I won't be abandoned. If I never ask for anything, I can't be rejected. During, what exactly shatters? After, what new, uglier, truer rule do they walk out with that actually qualifies them to sail under the future Pirate King? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to say, oh, Luffy just gets stronger after Marineford. No, he rewrites his entire model of leadership. Zoro doesn't just tank damage at Thriller Bark. He silently accepts that his job is to die first and never tell anyone. Sanji doesn't just cry in whole cake. He finally admits that being needed and being loved are not the same thing. So think of this video as a long, slightly unhinged group reread of the crew's lowest points, not a lecture. We're going to pause on ugly faces, over-analyze background seagulls, and occasionally roast our own Oda planned this from chapter 1 coping takes. And if you're still with me after that sales pitch, listen to me. You are exactly the kind of person I want next to me as we walk Luffy, Zoro, and the rest straight into their worst days. Because once you see how those hinges work, the next time Oda drops a straw hat to their knees, you're not just crying with them. You're already asking the real question: what monster is he quietly building out of this collapse? Let's start with the captain on the execution platform he never wanted. From power levels to psychological damage, how we're actually reading this crew Luffy on that execution platform is where a lot of you quietly switch the metric without admitting it. You say you're here to rank who's the strongest straw hat, but the second his shadow stretches under those marine rifles, you are not measuring power levels anymore. You're measuring how much of your own worst self you can stand to look at. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you watch Luffy break at Marineford, do you think, wow, he needs a better training arc? Or do you think, oh, that's the moment he realizes what being captain actually costs? Because here's the thing, strength in this story is not who wins the cleanest 1v1. Strength is whether you can stand on that scaffold, fail in front of everyone you love, have the ugliest version of you dragged into the sunlight, and still get back on the ship. With witnesses. With people who now know exactly how weak you are. Every Straw Hat has a specific core wound that Oda keeps poking like he's running a psychological experiment on a floating circus. Cowardice for Usopp, abandonment for Nami, monstrosity for Chopper and Robin, uselessness for Sanji when his hands are tied and his family tells him he's trash. Zoro's terror isn't losing. It's being too weak to carry Luffy's dream when Luffy can't stand. When you line those panels up, their worst moments are not random breakdowns. They're the precise instant that wound is fully exposed. No mask, no gag, no cool pose to hide behind. And listen to me, Oda is not interested in curing any of that. If you're waiting for a chapter where Usopp never feels fear again, or Robin wakes up one morning and simply isn't haunted by Ohara and the Void Century, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. The wound stays. What changes is the crew's relationship to it. They don't get fixed, they get integrated. Usopp's cowardice becomes the perspective that spots danger first. Sanji's uselessness spiral at Whole Cake Island becomes the boundary where the crew refuses to accept his self-erasure. Robin's I want to live doesn't erase her history. It plugs that ancient trauma into a network that will literally rewrite the world. So structurally, here's how we're going to read this crew. We start with Luffy, because every other wound orbits his job as captain. We move outward through Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, Robin, Franky, Brook, Jinbe, tracking one thing: how each collapse doesn't just change them, it rewires their role on the ship, and what they expect from Luffy in return. After Marineford, Luffy stops being the invincible son, and starts being a guy who can ask for help. After Thriller Bark, Zoro silently assumes the right hand is the one who bleeds, so the captain doesn't have to. And not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda keeps screaming this in the text. These are therapy arcs disguised as war arcs. So let me leave you with this. If you rip Marineford, Enies Lobby, Water 7, Whole Cake Island out of the story, if you delete every forced group therapy session this ship sails through, does this crew actually make it to Laugh Tale together? Or do they hit the first real-world ending weapon, crack along their old wounds, and sink long before they ever see the treasure? Luffy's true rock bottom isn't Marineford, and that's the problem. So when you pull all those war arcs out and the ship sinks early, there's one name that hits the ocean first: Luffy. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You probably think you already know his lowest point. Marineford, Ace dying in his arms. The scream, the silence, the whiteout panel where his brain basically blue screens. Then Amazon Lily, where this kid who has punched a celestial dragon, a sea king, and God himself just curls up and says, "I couldn't save Ace." That's the popular reading. That's the AMV with the sad piano. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because here's the thing, Marineford is the breakdown you can put on a t-shirt. The real fracture starts earlier, at Sabaody. When you line those panels up, it's disgusting how clear Oda is. Luffy walks into paradise, believing the same thing you believed about shonen protagonists at 12. If you yell loud enough and want it hard enough, the story will bend. Crocodile, punch him harder. Enel, punch him harder. Lucci, gear second, gear third, friendship speech, roll credits. Then Sabaody says, "Cool dream, watch this." Kuma doesn't outfight Luffy. He doesn't win a duel. He just presses a button and deletes the crew from the story one by one, while Luffy is literally on his knees, clawing at the ground, screaming their names as they pop like soap bubbles. No heroic last stand. No clever counter to the weapon. Just absolute helplessness. And that helplessness is the deeper wound. Marineford takes Ace. Sabaody takes Luffy's operating system. It's the first time the story proves to him that willpower is not a universal solvent. That there are systems, weapons, ancient powers, whatever label you want, that do not care how much you love your friends. So by the time we hit Marineford, we're not watching a sudden fall. We're watching the second hit on an already cracked structure. Listen to me. The true rock bottom is not the moment Ace dies. It's the moment post-war where Luffy lists their names and realizes he couldn't protect a single one of them. When he says he's too weak to be Pirate King, that's not melodrama, that's a complete collapse of his self-concept as captain. The dream that used to be a given becomes a question mark. And yet, that shattered version of Luffy? That's the one who finally becomes a captain worth following. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda literally rebuilds him around that failure. The time skip, the training, the way he starts actually thinking about his crew as people with their own breaking points instead of invincible NPCs following his dream. That all comes out of this. So if Luffy's worst moment is the template, we need to talk about how every Straw Hat gets their own Sabaody Marineford combo, the private deletion, then the public collapse. The question is, what do they rebuild on the other side? Sabaody. The day Luffy realizes his dream can't protect anyone. And nowhere is that blueprint clearer than Sabaody, because this is the first time the story looks Luffy dead in the eyes and says, "Your dream doesn't mean anything. Walk it back with me." The arc opens like a playground. Supernovas flexing, bounties flashing, everybody doing their little future legend entrance. You're treating it like a character select screen. You're having fun. Then a celestial dragon shoots Hachi in the middle of a crowd and the air just rips out of the room. Luffy walks up and in one of the most cathartic panels in One Piece, he decks a world noble so hard the manga itself is offended. Here's the thing. You and I read that punch like, oh, this is the moment. The righteous protagonist. The tyrant humbled. The arc is over. Roll credits. Oda lets you sit in that fantasy for what? A chapter? 2? Then Kuma walks in like the universe pressing the reset button. When you line those panels up, the tonal whiplash is insane. One second it's goofy chaos, giant mangroves, Luffy arguing about coating. The next it's a horror movie where the monster is bureaucracy with a Bible. Luffy throws himself at Kuma, punches landing, veins bulging, and nothing. No dent, no recoil. It's a child with a toy gun shooting a tank. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Up to this point, haven't you been trained to believe that if Luffy screams loud enough and bleeds hard enough, the story will bend? That's the shonen contract. That's the coping mechanism. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because Sabaody is the first time Oda breaks that contract on purpose. Luffy is pounding the ground, nails ripping, voice cracking, begging for strength, and the world does not care. His willpower doesn't unlock a new form, it doesn't summon a secret weapon, it doesn't even buy time. One by one, his crew just pops, Zoro, Sanji, Chopper reaching for him, Robin disappearing again, Usopp clawing at the earth as he's erased. Luffy is reduced to raw animal panic, screaming their names into a forest that goes silent. Listen to me. This is the real ancient terror the series is planting, the one Marineford later weaponizes. It's not, I might die. Luffy has never cared about that. It's, I might watch everyone I love vanish and be completely useless. That's the void century of his heart right there. That blank space where he thought Pirate King meant I can protect everyone, and discovers it currently means cosplaying Roger while my friends get deleted. So when he later decides to disappear for 2 years, to train instead of sprinting back out, that's not a random time skip. That's data. Sabaody is the experiment that proves his existing dream is cosmetic. If his punches bounce off, if his crew can be scattered like dandelion seeds in front of him, then the version of Pirate King he's chasing is just a hat and a title. The next time he stands in front of a world-scale system that can erase people, he refuses to be the toy gun. And the cruel part, the brilliant part, is that Sabaody is only the private test run. Marineford is the public beta. Which means, if this is how Luffy breaks, what does it look like when the rest of the crew hits their own Sabaody? Marineford. When Luffy finally breaks his own myth. So if Sabaody is the private failure, Marineford is Luffy submitting that failure as a public thesis statement. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You did the thing where you watched Marineford like a hype compilation, didn't you? Gear second entrances, Whitebeard Quake panels, the key toss, the jailbreak guest stars. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because when you line those panels up, Marineford is an escalation spiral Luffy cannot actually survive as the protagonist he thinks he is. He crashes into a war way above his pay grade, gets instant death stared by admirals, and the only reason he moves at all is because the story keeps handing him temporary scaffolds, Ivankov injections, Jinbe's taxi service, Whitebeard literally tilting the battlefield for him. He burns through every ally, every drug, every last hit point of plot armor, and on paper, he still wins the key beats. He reaches ace, he breaks the cuffs, he punches through the execution stand. If you freeze frame there, you can keep your internal myth. Luffy always finds a way. Then Akainu walks in and Oda tears that myth in half. Listen to me, the panel of Ace dying is not just sad, it is a targeted weapon aimed at Luffy's self-concept. Ace dies in his arms. The magma fist punched straight through the brother Luffy literally reoriented his entire story for, and Luffy's face just empties out. No rage, no giant speech, no new power-up. Just that blank, white-eyed, mouth-open nothing. That's the moment the I always get back up narrative doesn't just crack, it silently implodes. The universe called his bluff. The kid who yelled he'd be Pirate King just watched reality shrug, and Oda doesn't stop at the battlefield. He makes you sit in the post-war crater, Luffy waking up on Amazon Lily, doing the inventory of his life, and realizing every box is empty. Ace gone, Sabo gone, crew scattered. He screams that he couldn't protect anyone, tries to rip off his bandages like he can physically claw failure off his skin, and for the first time, he rejects the dream outright. Pirate King feels like a childish delusion, a fake crown on a kid who can't even save one brother, let alone a world. Here's the thing. This is where Jinbe quietly hijacks the narrative. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is screaming the answer in giant speech bubbles. Jinbe doesn't argue power levels. He reframes the whole metric. Remember what you still have. Remember your crew. He anchors Luffy in relationships instead of results and plants the seed that Pirate King isn't the guy who never fails. It's the guy whose people still choose to sail with him after he fails. That's why Marineford is Luffy's worst moment. He briefly believes the world's story about him. Too small, too weak, too late. The same flattening logic the world government uses on the ancient history and the void century he turns on himself. And then he chooses a different story. 2 years of training, not to become a world-ending weapon, but to be someone his crew can trust their lives to. So, if this is what it takes to break Luffy's myth, what does it look like when the rest of the Straw Hats have to watch their own legends die? The 2-year time skip is just Luffy's therapy montage. So when I say Marineford is Luffy's rock bottom, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. What do you think the time skip actually is? Because if your answer is, well, shonen power creep, we needed new forms, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Here's the thing. Oda doesn't cut away for 2 years because he's bored of drawing Gear second. He cuts away because the protagonist just discovered that his entire leadership style is a weapon aimed at his friends. Sabaody is the setup. Luffy charges in, punches a celestial dragon, and then watches, helpless, as a literal god presses the delete key on his crew. Marineford is the follow-through. He throws his body at the world's strongest forces and can't save a single person he loves. Together, those arcs answer the question, what happens when shouting louder doesn't work? And then, crucially, he does something he almost never does. He stops. He does not sprint back to Sabaody on pure willpower. He sends a message. 3D crossed out, 2Y. That tiny panel of him with the newspaper, marking over the 3 days. That is Luffy rejecting his own myth in ink. The guy who once went, "We'll figure it out on the way," is now saying, "Do not come. If we meet like this again, you will die." Listen to me. That is the opposite of a generic training montage. That is grief choosing delay. That is humiliation at Marineford crystallizing into a plan. He finally accepts that wanting to be Pirate King, wanting the One Piece, screaming about freedom, none of that matters if he's functionally a liability. So he signs up for the boring, unglamorous off-screen grind. No audience, no applause, just 2 years of letting Rayleigh tear down every lazy instinct he has about how fights, and by extension this whole system of a world, actually work. And when you line those panels up, pre-skip Luffy versus post-skip Luffy is night and day. Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, Wano. He listens to Law's plans, he lets Nami run weather, he trusts Usopp to snipe, he doesn't bench Robin's brain like it's optional DLC. He still punches the problem, obviously, but he's not assuming he alone is the weapon anymore. He's the one pointing a crew of specialists at the right pressure point. So you have to ask, does that more strategic, system-aware captain exist without his self-image getting obliterated at Marineford? Or do we stay in the version of the story where he keeps betting his friends' lives on the volume of his convictions? Because if Luffy's therapy arc is 2 silent years of training, what does it look like when the rest of the crew has to do theirs out loud in front of us? Zoro's humiliation, losing to Mihawk and choosing the burden. So if Luffy's therapy happens off-screen in a time skip, Zoro's happens in the most publicly humiliating way possible, on a random floating restaurant in front of his brand new captain, getting turned into kebab by his own childhood hero. We need to talk about Bharati because a lot of you remember it as Zoro's cool first loss, and not what it actually is, a full character assassination carried out by Oda with surgical precision. Zoro walks up to Drakkle Mihawk, the living embodiment of his dream, plants his feet, and declares exactly what he wants. And Mihawk responds by pulling out a tiny necklace knife, like he's about to slice an orange, not a human being. That's not disrespect. That's a power-scaling thesis statement. Here's the thing. Zoro does land blows. He fights through the fear. He pushes forward. He uses everything Queena's memory gave him. And it does nothing. Mihawk isn't even mildly inconvenienced. The world's greatest swordsman is literally bored. The Bharati staff is stunned, and the Straw Hats are forced to watch the guy who was supposed to be the serious one, the reliable one, get dismantled in under 5 minutes. When you line those panels up, it is not a rivalry, it's an execution. And then Oda twists the knife. Zoro is on his knees, bleeding out, dream in tatters, and he does the most Zoro thing imaginable. He turns his back. He exposes his chest and tells Mihawk a wound on the back is a swordsman's shame. That is not macho posturing. That is him saying, you can kill my body, but you are not allowed to kill my dream by making me run. Pride, as he's defined it up to this point, would say, retreat, lick your wounds, pretend this never happened. Instead, he chooses to let the entire ocean see how small he is. Listen to me. The humiliation is the point. The future right hand of the Pirate King lies in a pool of his own blood, while the final boss of his life barely broke a sweat. The gap is ancient weapon-sized. And then in that puddle of failure, he says the line that rewires the story. He vows never to lose again. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is meaner than both of us. You need to see how insane that is. He has just empirically proven he is not that guy. And his response is, cool, I'll just never let this happen again. And then he goes further. He turns to Luffy, the rubber idiot who got them into this mess, and effectively swears his sword to him. Is that okay, Pirate King? He binds his dream to someone else's flag immediately after being publicly exposed as a joke. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If your entire life goal just got turned into a gag reel, are you signing a lifelong contract with the nearest chaos gremlin? This is Zoro's first worst moment, because it forces a choice. Is he the protagonist of his own legend? Or is he willing to become the blade in someone else's hand? Pride says, I walk my own path. The dream says, I kneel next to this moron and make sure he lives long enough to reach the end. And he picks the dream. That's the pattern Oda locks in here. Zoro's strength will never just be about training arcs and bigger slashes. It's about his willingness to swallow humiliation and pain in silence if it means the crew's future stays intact. Barity is the prototype. Thriller Bark is the upgrade. And if you think nothing happened is just a cool meme line, this is fine as a coping mechanism. But as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because that scene is what happens when this vow finally comes due. Thriller Bark. Nothing happened, and the weight Zoro never shares. So, we need to talk about Thriller Bark, because this is the moment the Zoro is cool meme dies, and the Zoro is terrifying structural load-bearing pillar of this story thing really starts. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you think of that arc, do you actually feel the weight of what he does, or do you just replay nothing happened in your head like a hype TikTok sound? Here's the thing. The setup is engineered to make you feel like there is no move left on the board. Oars has already played bowling with the Straw Hats, Moria has puppeted Luffy's shadow into the ground, and Luffy has burned through every gear and every drop of idiot optimism he has. Then Oda drops Bartholomew Kuma in like an admin logging into the server. A Shichibukai, a government weapon. A man who is explicitly above Moria in the food chain just appears and says, "Okay, now hand over the head of Monkey D. Luffy." There is no clever strategy here, no ancient prophecy, just a wall. And Zoro walks up to the wall and tries to bargain with it. Not because he thinks he can win, but because he has already decided the hierarchy of deaths on this ship. Luffy dies last. Everyone else negotiates around that. First, he offers his own head in exchange, which is already insane because this is the guy who wants to be the world's greatest swordsman. Then Kuma escalates the deal into something worse. Take all of Luffy's accumulated pain and fatigue, all of that shredded nervous system and near death from fighting Oars and Moria, and put it into Zoro's body instead. No audience, no glory, no guarantee anyone will ever know. Listen to me. He accepts precisely because no one will understand the cost. When you line those panels up, it's brutal. Kuma manifests that bubble of pain, Zoro touches it, and the story just cuts away. No internal monologue, no speech about dreams or treasure or history. Just an off-screen scream Oda doesn't even letter. The next time we see him, Sanji finds him standing in a lake of his own blood. Arms spread, sword stuck in the ground like grave markers. And Zoro, who can barely stay conscious, chooses to say, "Nothing happened." That line is a flex, obviously. But it's also his worst self-talking. It's the version of Zoro who genuinely believes his only value to Luffy is to suffer in silence so the captain can keep shining, so the crew can keep laughing in ignorance of how close the weaponized world around them came to erasing them. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial of how broken that worldview is. And yet that same brokenness is what makes him the right hand of the future Pirate King. Thriller Bark is where his dream quietly drops to second place, protecting Luffy's path to Laugh Tale, to the One Piece, to whatever ancient system Roger refused to use, becomes the primary objective. This is Oda writing a job description in blood. The right hand is the one who takes the hit. The story itself can't afford the captain to take. Keep that image in your head, because when we get to the other Straw Hats rock bottoms, you're going to see the exact same pattern. Different flavor, same terrifying level of commitment. Zoro after Sabaody. When loyalty means admitting you're not enough. So let's take that job description in blood and make it even uglier, because we need to talk about Zoro after Sabaody. When the crew explodes on that archipelago, Zoro is useless, full stop. He's already wrecked from Thriller Bark, he gets one shot by Kuma, and then he's just gone. No last stand, no cool line, just erased. While Luffy is living his worst nightmare at Marineford, Zoro is stuck on Kuraigana Island with Perona and a bunch of ruins, forced to sit with one simple, disgusting truth. If he'd been stronger, maybe that disaster looks different. Maybe the captain doesn't have to watch his brother die. Here's the thing. You love to talk about Luffy's breakdown, crying, screaming. I couldn't save a single one of them. But you almost never sit with what that line does to Zoro. Because when you line those panels up, Luffy's failure speech is also Zoro's performance review. The right hand hears across the ocean that the shield failed. Not because Luffy says it, because the story does. So when Zoro rows back into the plot and sees Luffy after Marineford, shattered and bandaged on Amazon Lily, he doesn't give a motivational speech. He makes a calculation. The gap is too big. The new world will eat them. And the man who once screamed that he'd never lose again makes the single most humiliating choice of his life. He decides that his pride is now a luxury the crew can't afford. Cut to Kuraigana, round 2 with Mihawk. The first time at Barati, humiliation is forced on him. He loses. He bleeds. He swears an oath to never fall behind again. Classic Shunen rock bottom. But this, kneeling, swords in front of him, begging the same man to train him, that is worse, because this time the submission is voluntary. He is choosing to say, "You are above me, shape me." I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If Zoro actually became the world's greatest swordsman by surpassing Mihawk through Mihawk's own training, the legend is permanently co-signed by his master. There's an asterisk on the dream. And he does it anyway. Zoro is literally willing to risk his own endgame being framed as Mihawk's best student instead of the man who dethroned a god, if that's what it takes to become a better weapon in Luffy's hand. That's the evolved strength. He's not obsessed with winning on his own terms anymore. He's obsessed with being useful. If the choice is between pure, untainted pride and one more layer of armor between Luffy and the Void, he will swallow infinite pride. And I say that with love. If you still think Zoro is just the edgy rival who wants a 1v1 with Mihawk, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Post-time skip, that decision mutates into his whole New World persona. Zoro becomes the guy who quietly takes the hits the narrative can't put on Luffy, blocking Hakai for a second, tanking Enma's will, getting lost in Wano's underbelly of responsibility. He shoulders invisible burdens because he trained for that exact job under the man who once cut him down. Listen to me. Once you see Zoro's kneel as his second rock bottom, every later panel of him wordlessly stepping forward reads different, which raises a terrifying question for the rest of the crew. When their turn comes, will they kneel or will they break? Nami's Arlong. Park breakdown. When I can handle it, finally fails. And if Zoro's kneel is the blueprint for chosen burden, Nami is the case study for enforced self-reliance finally shattering. We need to talk about Arlong Park, because if you misread that breakdown as Nami being dramatic, you are missing the operating system upgrade that makes the entire crew possible. Here's the thing. Nami doesn't start the story as greedy navigator. She starts as a child drafted into an economic hostage situation. Years under Arlong, stealing and mapping for the monster who murdered her mother, weaponizing her own competence as a shield. She turns being useful into armor. If she can just be indispensable enough, clever enough, rich enough, she can buy back Kokoyashi. No feelings, no attachments, no crew, just a private ledger of pain and a number she has to hit. So when she's betraying Luffy and the others early on, that's not heel behavior. That's a survival protocol that's been running since she was 8. She pushes everyone away because intimacy is a liability. If they get close, they get targeted, and she already watched what targeting looks like. And I say that with love. A lot of you watch that and go, she's just being tsundere. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Then the turning point. Arlong steals the money. The villagers decide to throw their lives away, storming the park. Nami, who's been grinding for years in this private hell economy, realizes the math doesn't work anymore. There is no path where she solos her way to freedom. Watch what Oda does. She walks into the road, shaking, and starts stabbing her own tattoo. Over and over in the dirt, trying to carve Arlong out of her skin with a dull knife. That panel sequence is brutal. Blood, mud, the hat falling, the villagers screaming her name. When you line those panels up, what you're seeing isn't just despair. It's the death of the belief that I can handle it. She is literally attacking the symbol of the contract that said, you alone will carry this. And when she finally breaks and screams, Luffy, help me! That's not a cute moment of trust. That is her worst moment because it annihilates the only strategy that ever kept her alive. Do not burden anyone. Now look at Luffy's response. He doesn't interrogate her. He doesn't ask for a briefing, a backstory, a cost-benefit analysis of storming a Fishman fortress. He just puts the hat, the one-piece protagonist crown, his treasure on her head, like he's anchoring her in place, and walks forward. No questions, no conditions. Leadership is, your pain is enough data. Listen to me. That reprograms Nami. From that point on, her strength as navigator, tactician, financial brain only scales because she stops treating dependence as weakness. She still snaps, she still nags, but notice how aggressively she now plans around the crew's safety, not just her village. She lets them into the calculation. And once you see that, you have to ask, what happens when a different straw hat, one who doesn't cry in the dirt, hits their equivalent of Luffy, help me, and can't say it out loud? Post-Arlong Nami. Turning financial trauma into crew infrastructure. So here's the thing. Once Nami survives Arlong, the story does something very rude to her coping mechanisms. It doesn't get rid of them, it repurposes them. All that obsessive budgeting, all that every berry matters, all that hyperfixation on navigation that kept one girl alive under a Fishman warlord. The minute she's on the Merry as a real crewmate, Oda flips the lens and quietly goes, cool. That's infrastructure now. You watch it happen the first time they hit the Grand Line. Everyone else is treating this like a fun pirate road trip. Nami is calculating log poses, storm patterns, food stores. She's not being greedy. She's running a trauma-hardened risk assessment protocol on behalf of idiots she accidentally loves. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. How many times does this crew not die because Nami refuses to let them treat danger like a gag panel? Skypiea is your clean example. Luffy hears Sky Island and treats it like a theme park. Nami hears knock upstream, empty island, and a random ancient ruin in the clouds, and immediately starts clocking the colonial history, the missing city, the weird rules about illegal entry. She's the first one to feel that Enel's regime isn't just quirky. It's systemic exploitation written into the map. That's Arlong Park echoing. She's lived under a weaponized tax system before. She knows what it looks like when geography and law are tuned to squeeze people dry. Same thing in Whole Cake. Everyone memes on Sanji's drama, but watch Nami's face in Totoland. The second Big Mum's promised land hospitality starts coming with fine print. She goes cold. She reads the weather and the social weather at the same time. The homies, the living forests, the way information and food are controlled. That's an empire of surveillance and scarcity. She clocks the danger way earlier than Luffy, because she's already done the smiling tyrant who owns your future piece with Arlong. And listen to me, because this is the part fandom flattens. Nami's obsession with money never actually goes away. It just stops being about hoarding her way to freedom and becomes about provisioning a ship that's always one bad storm away from history repeating. When she's yelling about treasure now, she's also yelling about medical bills, ship repairs, bribes, and bracing the crew against the next ancient monster the new world throws at them. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend she's just a gag gremlin. Arlong Park's breakdown is the pivot. That Luffy help me in the dirt doesn't just give her permission to rely on someone, it gives her permission to be furious on other people's behalf. After that, watch how often she's the one calling out unfairness first. In Skypiea with the Shandians, in Fishman Island when Hody drags Arlong's legacy back up, in Whole Cake when Sanji's self-sacrifice crosses into self-destruction, she becomes one of the crew's moral barometers. She knows what exploitation feels like from the inside. She will not let them normalize it. But her real strength isn't the climate act. The weapon is her willingness to be visibly afraid and still steer. Thunderhead on the horizon, she shakes, she snaps, she still plots the course. That's the Arlong scene scaled up. I am terrified, but I am not handing the wheel to my fear. And when you line those panels up across the series, you realize Nami is the test case for a bigger pattern. What happens when a Straw Hat takes their worst survival skill and chooses to use it for everyone else, even when their hands are still shaking on the helm? Because once you see that in her, you have to go back to the guy on the figurehead, the one who doesn't plan anything, and ask a much uglier question. What does Luffy do when his version of Luffy help me finally hits, and there is no navigator who can chart a safe way through it? Robin's childhood, being punished for existing with forbidden knowledge. And if Nami is the navigator who weaponizes her worst survival skill, Robin is the opposite problem. The crew member whose whole life has been a case study in why you should never, ever ask for help in the first place. We need to talk about O'Hara. Not the meme version where you go, yeah, tragic backstory buster call, moving on. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you line those panels up, this is not just a sad flashback, it is a piece of psychological programming being installed in a child's brain. Robin starts as a lonely prodigy, a kid who can literally read the ancient history of the world and has no one her own age to talk to. The scholars are the first people who treat her like a person instead of an inconvenience. They give her books, patience, a place to sit at the grown-up table. In any other story, that's the warm, found family beat. In One Piece, Oda lets you breathe into that comfort just long enough to burn it down. Here's the thing. The world government doesn't just punish O'Hara for building a weapon. They annihilate an island because people dared to read. A child who can decipher poneglyphs is, in their logic, a walking void century leak. So she gets branded a demon for the crime of knowing too much. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that label doesn't stick to everything she does afterward. The worst moment is not the Buster Call explosions in the abstract, it's the sequence. Robin watching her mother turn away because duty to history comes first. The scholars choosing to die with their books. Saul trying to laugh her to safety, then getting frozen mid-rescue. The island literally burning behind her as a battleship voice tells her that her very existence is a crime. Every adult she ever trusted dies on the same day. For the same reason, they were close to Nico Robin. So what belief does a human brain build out of that? If you care about me, you die. If I care about you, I kill you. Listen to me. From that point on, the kindest thing Robin thinks she can do for anyone is to be temporary, to be useful, to be disposable. She doesn't attach, she subcontracts her own life. That's why adult Robin drifts through organizations that obviously treat her as a tool. Baroque Works, Crocodile, even the brief alliances with pirates and revolutionaries. She always assumes betrayal is the natural endpoint. She pre-betrays herself. She keeps a suitcase packed in her soul and never fully moves in. And I say that with love, but if you're still reading her early crew behavior as mysterious cool aunt, you're missing that she literally cannot imagine a world where staying doesn't get everyone killed, which is exactly why Enies' lobby hits like a truck. For the first time since O'Hara, her worst fear is playing out again. Battleships, a buster call, friends about to die because of her name, and she finally runs into a group of idiots who refuse to accept her core premise. They would rather burn the flag of the world than let her erase herself. So the real question isn't, why did Robin say, "I want to live"? It's whether that one sentence is enough when the story later drags her back toward the same ancient sin on a stage even bigger than Enies' lobby. Enies' lobby, "I want to live," as Robin's rejection of her own death wish. So when Robin says, "I want to live," you're not watching a hype catchphrase. You're watching a woman argue against her own death sentence in real time. And the prosecutor is her. We need to talk about how committed she is to that sentence before Enies' lobby even starts. She doesn't get kidnapped. She walks out. She takes CP9's hand. She signs the deal, her life in exchange for the Straw Hats being spared the wrath of the government that already annihilated one island for less. From her perspective, this is not a tragic misunderstanding. This is the correct move. She is the demon of O'Hara, the living poneglyph, the walking embodiment of a void-century crime, and anywhere she stays long enough burns. So she does the only thing that has ever protected people in her experience. She disappears. Here's the thing. The story immediately calls her bluff, because the crew does not read that as a noble sacrifice. They read it as theft. She stole herself from their ship. So they chase her to the one place in the world you are absolutely not supposed to attack. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If you or I were writing this story, we would have stopped at dramatic rescue. Oda goes further. He makes her say out loud what she actually believes. On top of the Tower of Justice, you get the ugliest version of Robin, not the assassin, the fatalist. She tells Luffy she wants to die. She screams it. And when you line those panels up with little Robin on the burning bridge of O'Hara, watching the Buster Call erase her home because she can read some ancient rock, it's the same sentence, just aged 20 years. The world is better if I'm not in it. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend this is just about cool rebellion against the government. It's a suicide note wrapped in a deal with CP9. So Luffy does the most disrespectful thing possible to that worldview. He refuses to move until she says the opposite. He will not save someone who insists she's disposable. That "say you want to live" demand is brutal, because he's asking her to admit the most selfish thing she can imagine, that she wants to stay with them, even if it drags the ancient sin of O'Hara onto their deck. And then she breaks. "I want to live!" It's her worst moment because she is nakedly needy, sobbing, abandoning the one rule that kept her safe for decades. Don't want things. But it's also the best, because the second she says it, the crew can answer. They burn the flag. They literally declare war on the world to make room for that one sentence. Listen to me. Everything you love about post-Enies lobby Robin, her calm, almost maternal presence, the way she nudges Luffy toward the future instead of away from the past, rests on this. Once she believes she's allowed to exist, her strength stops being about running from ancient history and starts being about making sure there is a tomorrow where that history can be read. And the terrifying part, which the story cashes in on later, is that she is not the only Straw Hat whose "I want to live" will drag the entire crew into a war they cannot yet see. Robin in the new world. From disposable tool to keeper of the future. And once you see that, you can't unsee what Oda does with Robin in the new world. Because after Enies' lobby, she doesn't just live. She starts planning for a world where that choice has consequences. Here's the thing. Pre-Enies lobby Robin is a survival algorithm in sunglasses. She reads the poneglyphs for herself, hoards forbidden history like a dragon hoards treasure, and keeps one foot out the door. Post-Enies lobby Robin, she's running the long game for the crew. On Sabaody, Fishman Island, Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, Zoo, Wano. She's the one quietly asking, how does this connect back to the Void Century, to the weapons, to what Luffy will eventually have to stand in front of? She's not just deciphering stones. She's building a mental map of the system Roger saw and walked away from, so that this time, when someone reaches the end, they're not too early. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You probably underrate how emotional that shift is because Robin expresses it in whispers, not speeches. Watch how she moves through the crew after Enies' lobby. Chopper spirals about being a monster. She doesn't argue with him. She tells him she admires that part of him because she knows what it feels like to be the thing everyone calls a demon. Franky carries that Water 7 guilt, that I built the train that killed Tom weight. She's the one who treats his past like data, not damnation. Even with Luffy in Dressrosa and Wano, when he's making these insane history-altering calls, she's the calm voice that says, essentially, if this is the captain you are, then this is the future I'm willing to stand in. That's a direct inversion of her worst moment. Her whole life before that tower is, attachment gets people killed, so disappear first. After I want to live, staying becomes the risky move. Every island in the new world is Robin waking up and recommitting to that scream. She knows better than anyone that the second the world connects Straw Hats and Void Century Archaeologist, the bounty doesn't just go up, the crosshairs narrow, and she stays anyway, daily, quietly. No drama, no running gag, just a constant, terrifying yes. Listen to me. In a story obsessed with inherited wills and ancient promises, Robin is the proof of concept. She embodies the idea that the future is literally built by people who were told they shouldn't exist. O'Hara burns, the scholars die, the government tries to delete a child because she can read the operating manual of the planet, and that same child grows up to be the one person on Luffy's ship who can actually interface with the thing everyone's chasing. When you line those panels up, the cruelty isn't random, it's scaffolding. And this is where her strength gets misread. People go, Robin's power-up is knowledge. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Her real power is the courage to let that knowledge endanger people who insist on loving her anyway. To look at the Straw Hats, remember a buster call aimed at her existence, and still say, yes, I will be the keeper of the future you're sailing toward. That courage is born on that tower, in that horse-broken, I want to live. And it's the same courage Luffy and the others are going to need when they finally stand in front of the system at the heart of the One Piece and decide what deserves to survive. Because Robin isn't just preparing to read history, she's preparing the crew to become it. And she's not the only one whose worst moment quietly rewires the fate of the entire world. Sanji's whole cake island, the prince who thinks he's trash. And Sanji is the proof that Robin isn't an exception. She's the blueprint. Because if Robin's worst moment is about wanting to live, Sanji's is about believing he doesn't deserve to. We need to talk about Whole Cake Island Sanji, because a lot of you still file that away as the cool, tragic prince arc. And listen to me, that's a cope. This is not romantic. This is a character having a full-scale nervous breakdown while the story rips up his operating system in front of you. Run the history. As a kid in Germa, Sanji is the failure. No exoskeleton, no super strength, no utility. His own father locks him in an iron mask and a dungeon, literally holds a funeral for him while he's still alive. The only time Judge acknowledges his value is as a political chip to marry off. That's it. That's the script. You are trash, except when you are convenient as treasure on someone else's balance sheet. Then Zeph happens. One old pirate chef who loses a leg and almost starves to death to keep this crying kid alive. And suddenly Sanji gets a counter-narrative. You are worth saving, you are worth feeding. Your hunger and other people's hunger matter. But here's the thing. When you line those panels up, Zeph doesn't magically erase Germa. He just overlays a better story on top of the existing damage. The abuse is still in there, running in the background like malware. So when he's dragged back into Germa and Big Mum's territory, it's not a new prison. It's a sequel. Exploding handcuffs on his wrists, a photo of Zeph on the table, and the message is crystal clear. Your hands, the ones you cook with, the ones you fight with, are ours. Do what we say, or the one man who proved you had value dies. That's not just coercion, that's weaponized history. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When Sanji walks away from the Sunny calling them burdens, how many of you took that at face value the first time? Because this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Sanji is not revealing a secret truth about the crew. He is parroting Germa's logic at himself. He is pre-rejecting his family before they can reject the useless son again. Which is why the scene where he beats Luffy bloody is his absolute rock bottom. He knows exactly who he's hitting. He knows this is the one captain in the entire story who never once treated him as a bargaining chip. He throws the kicks anyway. Then he collapses over that ruined bento, sobbing in the carriage, because he understands every layer of what he just did and does it regardless. That is self-hatred in action, inflicting on your found family the same violence that made you think you were garbage. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is viciously consistent. Sanji's worst moment is him agreeing with his abusers. My only worth is as a sacrifice. If I hurt them now, I can save them later. He turns himself into a human shield and calls it love. And Luffy's answer is to refuse the entire premise. He stands outside the castle, starving, beaten, waiting, saying in effect, I will not consume this version of you. That's the pivot. That's the moment the Germa script starts to crack. But if Sanji's worth can be rewritten by one idiot captain on a castle lawn, what happens when that same logic gets aimed at the entire world order? I want to go back to the Sunny. Sanji finally chooses himself. So here's the thing. That castle lawn scene is not the catharsis. It's the crack in the dam. The actual flood is Sanji finally saying the quiet part out loud. I want to go back to the Sunny. Not I should, not they need me. Want. Listen to me, because if you treat that as just a loyalty beat, you're flattening one of the most surgically written self-worth arcs in the story. When he drops the mask in front of Luffy, he's not just apologizing for the kicks and the insults. He's confessing that his entire identity has been built on the idea that his hands only have value when they're serving someone else's script. Zeph's dream, Baraty's customers, Germa's politics, Big Mom's tea party. He genuinely believes his cooking is a weapon other people point. And then you get Luffy's response, which is one of the dumbest, most theologically correct things this series has ever done. He refuses to eat, refuses to move, refuses to accept food from anyone else in a world where food is everywhere and cooks are not rare. That's the meta joke. In a setting with entire islands themed around sweets and feasts, your protagonist just goes, no, I'm on hunger strike until my guy feeds me. When you line those panels up, what Oda is doing is reclassifying Sanji's cooking from generic service. Any chef could do this, to a non-transferable bond. This isn't treasure you can hand off. It's an ancient weapon-level key that only works because Sanji is Sanji. Luffy isn't just saying, you're useful. He's saying, this piece of the story does not function without you specifically. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. How many times have you read that scene as, wow, Sanji's loyalty is back, and stopped there? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because the real pivot is that Sanji is not just choosing Luffy, he's choosing himself with Luffy. He's accepting that he is allowed to be the one who is cooked for, cared for, fought for. The caretaker is allowed to be hungry. And once that switch flips, his whole role on the Sunny mutates. Post whole cake, he's louder about what he feels, more shameless about calling the crew his family, less like a waiter fussing over guests, and more like a big brother defending his own kitchen. Think about Wano. He's not just protecting Nami and Robin because they're women. He's protecting my crew with a possessiveness that would have terrified pre-WCI Sanji, because it implies he belongs there. That's why his kindness doesn't kill him. The worst version of Sanji is the one who exiles himself forever, still cooking, still smiling, slowly bleeding out on someone else's ship. The version we get is the one who walked right up to that edge, realized the only people who ever saw his value were sailing away, and chose to run after them instead. And if one broken prince can rewrite his script like that, what does that say about the rest of this crew and the way they metabolize their own lowest points? Usopp at Water 7. When cowardice explodes into open rebellion. So if Sanji is the prince who runs back to the ship, Usopp is the guy who convinces himself the ship is better off without him and then burns the bridge on the way out. We need to talk about Water 7, because this is not just the sad argument about a boat. This is Usopp taking every insecurity he's been swallowing since Syrup Village and weaponizing it against the one person who never doubted him. Here's the thing. By the time the crew hits Water 7, the gap is obvious. Luffy is punching sea monsters into orbit. Zoro is cutting buildings. Robin reads the ancient history. Even Nami is steering through death storms like it's a Tuesday. And Usopp, he gets jumped in an alley by Franky's men, beaten bloody and robbed of 200 million like a random NPC. That scene hurts because you can feel him doing the math. If he can't even protect the money, how is he supposed to protect the crew? Then Oda twists the knife with the Going Merry. The ship that literally carried them through every early miracle is diagnosed as terminal. No weapon, no treasure, no secret Roger blueprint is going to fix this. And Luffy, who has been taught by the sea that sentimentality gets you killed, makes the call. They're getting a new ship. When you line those panels up, Usopp's meltdown is not about wood and nails. It's about watching the one weak member of the crew, the ship, get declared obsolete right after he himself got treated like dead weight. So he explodes. He accuses Luffy of abandoning a friend, of throwing away their shared history, of not understanding what the merry means. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You have absolutely read a comment saying Usopp was right. I have too. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because the subtext is screaming. Usopp isn't just afraid the merry is being left behind. He's terrified he's next. That's why the duel is so brutal. He challenges Luffy, the future Pirate King, with slingshots, dials, and pre-planned traps. It's the most Usopp fight imaginable. No raw power, just desperate ingenuity. For a few pages, you almost believe he can do it, because Oda lets you live inside his delusion. Then Luffy walks through it. Not easily, but inevitably. Usopp ends up broken on the ground, his body wrecked, his pride shattered, still trying to talk like he has any leverage. And here's the real rock bottom. He walks away. Not because they kicked him out, but because facing the possibility that they might still want him, exactly as he is, cowardice and all, is more unbearable than exile. Listen to me, that is so much worse than just losing a fight. The emotional cost radiates outward. Luffy is devastated, Nami is furious, Chopper is torn in half. The fracture forces all of them to confront a question they've been dodging with jokes and bravado. What does it actually mean to be useful on this ship? On the Sunny, that question becomes design philosophy. They don't just need a stronger hull. They need a crew culture where the sniper who runs and lies and shakes can still be indispensable. And if Usopp can turn open rebellion into the foundation of his loyalty, what does that say about the next time the crew breaks itself on purpose? Sogeking and the sniper on the tower. Usopp's fear turned into function. So when Usopp walks away in Water 7, you and I both clock it as betrayal. But listen to me. Oda is already loading the next piece of the weapon here. Not a cannon, a perspective. Because Usopp doesn't just stroll back on at Enies' lobby with a sheepish, "my bad." He shows up as Sogeking, a paper-thin mask, a theme song, and a fake country of snipers because he literally cannot face his crew as himself yet. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. He is still the guy who ran. He's just wrapped that fear in a cape so he can move. And here's the thing. The story rewards that. When Luffy is about to launch himself at the world government, who pulls the trigger on the most disrespectful shot in the series? It's not Zoro. It's not Sanji. It's the coward in a mask, sniping down the world government flag from a tower. That panel is Oda screaming in your face. This is what courage looks like in this story. Not absence of fear. Weaponized fear, pointed in the right direction, then you get the key shot. Literally. Spandam, parading Robin across the bridge, dangling those handcuff keys like victory. And from a distance that would make real-world snipers sweat, Usopp threads a single bullet through chaos and wind and plot armor to free her. When you line those panels up, what he's doing is insane. He's shaking, he's screaming, but he still makes the shot. His terror doesn't disqualify him, it calibrates him. And while Luffy is being turned into paste by Lucci, who is doing tactical support, live commentary, and emotional regulation from a collapsing tower, it's Sogeking barking at Luffy through the transponder snail, telling him where to move, how to think, why he can't fall here. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Would Luffy have actually finished that fight without someone on the outside refusing to look away? Raw power is in the tunnel. Usopp is the guy watching the whole maze. That's why his apology hits so hard later. He finally drops the mask, bows so low you can feel his spine creak, and admits he was wrong. He was scared. He was useless. And Luffy, the guy who could bench press buildings by that point, doesn't forgive him because he got stronger. He forgives him because he came back. Because usefulness on this ship is not measured in bounties. It's measured in whether you show up when you're terrified. Usopp's worst moment, running from the Going Merry, screaming that he can't keep up, becomes the exact data set he uses to understand everyone else's breaking point. He knows what it costs to stand and fight because he has the receipt for what it costs to run. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is mean in a very precise way. You can see him turning Usopp into the crew's barometer for human limits. So if the sniper on the tower is what happens when fear is allowed on the ship without being shamed off the deck, we need to talk about what happens when that same logic gets applied to someone who thinks he's not even human. Chopper's monstrosity, the rumble ball and self-hatred. So if the sniper on the tower is what happens when fear is allowed on the ship without being shamed off the deck, we need to talk about what happens when the thing you're afraid of is literally your own body. Because Chopper is not just the cute doctor. Chopper is a horror story that keeps trying to pretend it's a mascot. And I say that with love. Here's the thing. From day one, this kid is told his existence is an error. Reindeer reject him because of the blue nose. Humans shoot at him because he's a monster. The one person who looks at him and doesn't flinch is Hiluluk, the world's worst doctor and the world's best theologian, who essentially preaches, a person's worth is not defined by their body. It's defined by the will burning inside it. That's the ancient law of one piece in a lab coat. But I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Does Chopper believe that? Or does he just repeat it like a prayer he hopes will someday be true? Because as soon as Hiluluk dies, Chopper does the most predictable, heartbreaking thing. He tries to fix the body. If the world said, your form is wrong, he will brute force his way into a form that's useful. Enter the Rumble Ball. This is not just a power-up candy. This is a self-hating research project. He hacks his own devil fruit, carves his identity into 7 neat forms, and then, way at the edge of the chart, there's Monster Point. The thing he is most afraid of. The silhouette that looks exactly like what those humans saw when they aimed their guns. And he eats it anyway. Because if becoming the thing he fears is the only way to be helpful, he'll do it. That's not courage. That is a child agreeing with his abusers on different terms. When you line those panels up, Chopper at Drum, at Enies lobby, at Thriller Bark, you see the same pattern. He loses control. He terrifies allies. He wakes up later, bandaged, tiny again, staring at his hooves like they're contaminated. Everyone else is saying, "You saved us." His face is saying, "What did I just prove about what I really am?" Listen to me. Chopper's worst moments are not the rampages. The rampages are loud. The real damage is in the quiet aftermath shots where he's turned away from the crew, thinking like a failed experiment who survived his own test run. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to call that just comedy. Oda is doing medical body horror in a children's pirate manga. And not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is mean in a very precise way. He keeps making Chopper's greatest contributions tied to that form he hates. So the question isn't, will Monster Point hurt the crew? It's, what does Chopper think he deserves to be? A pet mascot? A walking bioweapon? Or a doctor who decides what his body is for? Later arcs will answer that. Monster Point will stop being an accident and become a chosen, controlled weapon of protection. But he doesn't get there by skipping the self-hatred. He gets there by dissecting it. And once you see that, you're ready for the next crew member who weaponizes their own body in a very different way. From monster to doctor, Chopper owning the thing he fears most. So when we say Monster Point stops being an accident, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You remember how terrified you were of it the first time, but do you actually track how quietly Oda rewires that terror into trust? Because early on, the rumble ball is a horror device. Every time Chopper pops one, you flinch a little. Is this the time he loses it? Drum, Alabaster, Enies lobby. You watch him miscalculate, stack too many rumble balls, and vanish into that 10-story silhouette that doesn't know friend from enemy. That's not a power-up. That's a medical side effect. It's the worst-case scenario of a doctor experimenting on himself and becoming the case study. Here's the thing. Oda doesn't fix that by hand-waving the danger away. He fixes it by making Chopper study his own nightmare like it's a disease. Time skip hits, and suddenly the rumble ball isn't a gamble, it's a protocol. 1 pill, 30 minutes, defined forms. The chaos gets turned into a treatment plan. When you line those panels up, pre-time skip berserk rampages versus Punk Hazard and Dressrosa, you go from please don't hurt your friends to he's choosing the exact form they need. And then in the new world he goes back to Monster Point, on purpose. Fishman Island, Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, whole cake. You see him call the shot. He knows he'll burn stamina, he knows it's risky, and he does it anyway because the crew is boxed in and somebody has to become the wall. That panel of him bracing against the giant kids or body checking a massive enemy away from Nami and the others. That's the same silhouette from Enies lobby, but now it's aimed. Listen to me. This is where the doctor thing gets viciously elegant. Chopper is the healer and the hazard. He's the one mixing sedatives and bandages, and he's also the bioweapon you unleash down the corridor. Enemies don't just have to get past his medicine, they have to survive the thing that medicine created. He is literally both cure and disease, and he's the one deciding which one you get. And the crew, they refuse to be scared of him. They hang off his antlers, they cheer for Monster Point like it's just another gear from Luffy. No one flinches, no one backs away. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that doesn't matter. Their casual acceptance is exposure therapy. Every time they treat the monster as normal, they overwrite abomination with Guardian in his brain. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is meaner than both of us. You have to see the loop here. Those early breakdowns where Chopper is convinced he's a mistake, an ancient weapon in plushie form. That's the foundation. He stays anyway. He keeps sailing, keeps treating, keeps transforming, and by refusing to leave, he proves his own thesis wrong. Which sets you up for the next crew member who looks in the mirror and sees a weapon instead of a person, but doesn't get the luxury of being treated as cute while they work it out. Franky's guilt, building the train that killed his father figure. Franky is what happens when you take Chopper's "I'm a weapon" anxiety and actually put it on train tracks, literally. You want to talk about a character who thinks his very existence is a loaded gun pointed at the people he loves? We need to talk about Cutty Flam. Here's the thing, Franky doesn't start as a clown in a Speedo. He starts as a kid genius building battle Frankies, because he wants to prove his worth to Tom, the legendary shipwright who took him in. Tom builds the Oro Jackson for Roger, and smiles through a death sentence for it, because in this story, creating great ships is treated like touching the Void Century with your bare hands. It's dangerous. It's "you will be erased from history" dangerous. But Franky hears all that and goes, "Cool, I'm going to build war machines." And Oda being Oda, that's not just a gag. The government attack on Water 7 is literally staged around Franky's toys being used as the pretext. Tom takes the blame, not because Franky is innocent, but because Tom believes a craftsman stands in front of his creations when the weaponized state comes knocking. When you line those panels up, it's brutal. The trial, the sea train, Tom smiling, Franky screaming that his ships are the problem. Then you hit the moment. Tom is chained, marched to the puffing Tom, and Franky snaps. He throws himself on the tracks. This is not a heroic sacrifice. This is a tantrum of guilt. He's saying, "If my ships took you away, then I'll stop the train with my body." And the story does not reward him. The train does not stop. He gets mangled, annihilated, and has to rebuild himself as a cyborg with his own hands. Listen to me. That's the nightmare. The kid who thinks his inventions killed his father figure is now literally made of weapons. So of course Franky comes out the other side, convinced his hands destroy whatever they touch. Of course he hides behind bravado, a mask of pervy showmanship and goofy dances. That whole Franky family dismantling ships for scrap, attacking the Straw Hats, beating Usopp and stealing the Going Merry money sequence. It reads like a guy trying to preemptively be the villain so nobody gets close enough to be collateral damage. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. How many times did you write Franky off in Water 7 as just the loud gag antagonist before Enies lobby forced you to reevaluate everything? Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda designs him to be misread. He pretends he doesn't care about ships, about people, about legacy, while quietly crying over the Going Merry's keel and risking his life to save Robin. The pivot is the 1000 Sunny. Building Sunny is not just new boat unlocked, congrats. It's Franky staging a direct rematch with his own trauma. Last time his craftsmanship carried Roger to the end of the world and helped get Tom executed. Last time his battle Frankies were framed as the weapon. This time he forges a ship that is explicitly a home. He uses Adam wood, a material associated with ancient, almost mythic quality, and pours every lesson from Tom into it. A ship that can cross the world, climb to the sky, dive under the sea, and still bring its crew back. Sunny is his atonement and his promise. He's saying, "My hands are not a curse. This ship will not take a family away. It will carry one." And the next crew member who boards that deck, dragging his own history with war machines and state violence, is going to force that promise to its breaking point. The 1000 Sunny, Franky's second chance at not destroying everything. So when Franky hands that ship over and says, "This is the 1000 Sunny," he's not just giving Luffy a ride. He's putting his crime scene back on the tracks and daring the story to hit it again. Because listen to me, the Sunny is not just a glow-up from the Merry. It's Franky taking every single catastrophic choice he's ever made and reverse engineering them into a home. Adam wood isn't just rare lumber, It's literal plot armor grown out of ancient world infrastructure, bought with Iceberg's trust and the last of Tom's legacy. He's using Tom's blueprints, the same technical brain that once helped design a government weapon, and saying, this time, these hands are not going to be the world government's. Here's the thing. When you line those panels up, the flashback of him screaming over Tom's execution, the train he built becoming the rail that delivers his father figure to death, the self-destruction that turns him into a cyborg, that's not flavor text. That is Oda hard-coding a rule into Franky's character. Your inventions can kill the people you love if you don't own what you're building. So he overcorrects. He obsessively overcorrects. Every bulkhead of the Sunny is a thesis statement. Compartmentalized soldier dock system, lifeboat channels, coup de burst as both escape and attack. Mass design that can eat a storm and stay standing. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial if you pretend it's just, haha, shipwright likes gadgets. He is building a weaponized arc and trying to prove a moral point to himself. A ship can be a safe haven and a cannon at the same time. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. That breakdown when the Straw Hats ask him to join at Water 7, that's not comedy. That's a man doing the math in real time. If he steps on that ship, then whatever happens to it is his fault. Again. Accepting Luffy's outstretched hand means accepting the possibility that the Thousand Sunny becomes Tom's sea train. 2.0. A beautiful machine that escorts his family to hell. So he cries, he runs, he fights it, and then he walks back anyway because his guilt is louder than his fear. From that moment on, watch how he treats the Sunny in battle. He doesn't just fire the Gaon cannon. He throws his body in front of incoming blows, literally using his cyborg frame as a shield when the hull is threatened. He talks to the ship, praises it, apologizes to it. The Sunny is a person to him, but it's also a symbol. His promise to Tom and his promise to this new crew, that his craft will never again be the rail line to someone's execution platform. Franky's real strength doesn't come from cola or cyborg upgrades. It comes from those tracks. From knowing exactly what it feels like to build the wrong thing and watch it run people over. So he dedicates his life to building the right one and defending it with a fanaticism that, later, is going to clash beautifully and violently with the next man who treats ships as disposable weapons. Because the moment a former warlord steps aboard and calls the Sunny a good ship, that's when Franky's second chance meets someone else's last resort. Brook's 50 years of isolation, laughing on a ship of corpses. And then you cut from that dockyard fanatic to a man sitting alone on a ship full of corpses, laughing so he doesn't shatter. We need to talk about Brook, because if Franky is what you do after you destroy your own home, Brook is what happens when your home dies around you and leaves you behind. You know the story beats, but I want you to actually sit in them for a second. Rumbar pirates, sailing happily, making this dumb, beautiful promise to a lonely whale. We'll go around the world and come back, so keep ramming your head into that wall until we return. Then the poison hits. One by one, musicians collapse. The captain dies. Brook listens to his crew record one last song for Laboon, knowing the record will outlive the band. Then he dies too, and the story does not let him stay dead. His soul wanders, lost, for a year. When he finally finds the ship again, his body is already decayed. Everyone else is bones. He stands up as a skeleton on a graveyard deck. No crew, no captain, no Laboon. Just a promise with no delivery mechanism. Here's the thing. Most series would fade to black there. Oda lets him keep going. Decades. Not years. Not a sad training montage. Decades drifting in the Florian Triangle. Brook talking to inanimate skeletons like they're still his friends. Playing music for an audience of dust and broken chairs. Losing his reflection, his shadow, and eventually his sense of time. When you line those panels up, the gag school jokes stop being cute and start reading like a man desperately refusing to acknowledge he's the last one left. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. How many times did you treat Brook's yo-ho-ho skull joke as filler? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. The constant joking, the loud laughter, the over-the-top perv gags. These are not just comedy. They're a survival protocol. If he ever stops performing, he has to look directly at 50 years of failure to keep a single promise to a single whale. So when the Straw Hats show up and Luffy hits him with the most casually devastating line in his entire story, "We met Laboon," that's not just a cute callback to early One Piece. That is a weapon-grade sentence. Suddenly, the abstract guilt has coordinates again. There is a whale right now, still waiting on the other side of the red line, and Brook has to admit those 50 empty years were real, not a dream he can laugh away. And this, listen to me, is why his yes to Luffy is so heavy. Brook's worst moment isn't a single panel. It's an entire era where his life is a museum exhibit no one visits. His strength is choosing to step out of that exhibit, to love a new crew knowing he might watch them die too. That decision, to risk another Rumbar, another Laboon, that's the same emotional engine that's going to drive the rest of the Straw Hats when we talk about the ones who broke and didn't have 5 decades to rehearse their smile. Brook on the Sunny, choosing to live after already being dead. And here's where Brook gets terrifying, because he's the one Straw Hat who has already lived the nightmare everyone else is afraid of. Not metaphorically, literally. He did the "everyone I love is dead, and I'm alone on a ghost ship for decades" speedrun. And then Oda asks him the most messed up question in the whole story. If you've already lost everything, do you dare sign up for that risk again? When Luffy invites him on the Sunny, Brook doesn't just go, "Yo ho ho, free food, let's go." He hesitates. Hard. He's thinking about the Rumbar pirates rotting in that fog. He's thinking about Laboon slamming into the red line forever, because they never came back. And he's thinking, very quietly, if I walk onto another ship and it sinks, that's my fault this time. You can see it in the way he keeps bringing up being a burden, being old, being a walking curse. Too weak, too late, too risky. Here's the thing, Luffy does not give a single strategic speech. He doesn't weigh pros and cons. He just says, basically, "You're funny, I like you, get on the boat." That stupidly simple acceptance cuts straight through 50 years of survivor's guilt. Not because Luffy is smarter than him, but because Brook has been trapped in a museum of his own tragedy and someone finally kicks the glass and goes, "You're not an exhibit, you're crew." And this is where we need to talk about Brook's jokes. People love to treat the skull gags and panty bits as pure comic relief. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Brook is the crew's morale system administrator. On Thriller Bark, on Sabadi, on Whole Cake Island, he is constantly playing, singing, making death puns, not because he doesn't understand despair, but because he knows exactly what a ship sounds like when the laughter stops and never comes back. When you line those panels up, the pattern is brutal. Brook is the one who will walk alone into Big Mum's territory, face a Yonko, and let his bones get shattered for a chance at a rubbing of an ancient stone. He already lost his body once. He already floated as a soul over a sea of corpses. His willingness to risk his life again is not recklessness. It's informed consent from someone who has seen the absolute worst possible outcome and still chooses to care. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You cried more at Laboon than at half the world-ending weapon exposition, didn't you? Because that promise is the hinge. Brook's heart is carrying 2 crews now, the Rumbar pirates and the Straw Hats, and instead of that weight crushing him, it turns into propulsion. Every song is for Laboon and for Luffy. Every duel, every joke, every yo-ho-ho is him refusing to let either promise die. Listen to me. Brook's strength is built on those empty decades. He knows what a ship with no voices feels like. That's why, on the Sunny, he is violently allergic to silence. He will fill it with music, with bad jokes, with memories, because he refuses to let this new history become another dead corridor. And that's the template for the rest of the crew. Next, we're going to talk about what happens when someone like Zoro or Sanji hits their own version of that void without the luxury of already being dead. Jinbe's betrayals, serving big powers and losing his people. So, if Brook is what happens when you survive the void alone, Jinbe is what happens when you survive it in a boardroom. We need to talk about the guy whose trauma is not a battlefield, it's a negotiation table. Jinbe starts as a sun pirate under Fisher Tiger, literally branded by the same slave mark they turn into a flag. That crew is born as a rejection of systems. No world government, no celestial dragons, no polite compromises. Then Tiger dies. The dream shatters, and listen to me. Jinbe's response is not to double down on rage, it's to do the most adult thing possible in this story. He becomes a Shichibukai to protect Fishman Island. On paper, that's smart, strategic, responsible. You've seen the fandom takes. He did what he had to do. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because the cost of that decision is that Jinbe is suddenly sitting in the same architecture that killed his captain. He's aligning with the world government, then later with Big Mom, and every time he does it, the story quietly shows you the bill coming due. Fishman Island protected under Big Mom is a protection racket. Candy tribute, fear, the promise of annihilation if they step out of line. Under the Shichibukai system, his title helps legitimize the very order that hunts his own people. When you line those panels up, the pattern is brutal. While Jinbe is in some throne room or council chamber, his people are suffering under the logos on the walls behind him. And then there's Arlong, Jinbe's personal worst export. He lets Arlong go to the East Blue, essentially outsourcing the rage of Fishman oppression to some backwater sea. And what does that become? Nami's entire childhood turned into a map-drawing prison. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you first watched Arlong Park, you did not think, ah yes, this is secretly Jinbe's failure arc. But Oda did. Every human Arlong brutalizes, every time Nami's hands shake over a chart that's folded into Jinbe's guilt. His core wound is failed responsibility scaled to an absurd degree. He doesn't just feel responsible for Arlong. He feels responsible for every fishman crushed by the surface world, every kid who grows up hearing that the sun is for humans. So his worst moments are not when he's bleeding. They're when he's standing there, formally recognized, realizing he has traded too much moral ground for too little safety. Here's the thing. That's why his decision to join Luffy lands so hard. It's a different category of allegiance. Not to a system, but to a captain who breaks them, a man who will punch a celestial dragon instead of signing a treaty. Jinbe is betting that this time, his loyalty isn't a leash on his people, it's a weapon pointed at the right throne. And that sets up the real question for the crew going forward. What happens when Luffy, who refuses crowns, becomes the biggest system any of them have ever followed? I am your captain's man. Jinbe's leap from fear to faith. Because here's the thing. When we say Luffy becomes a system, Jinbe is the stress test. He's the guy who has actually lived his entire life under weaponized systems. And he's the one who decides, on screen, to treat Luffy like a different kind of world government. Whole cake is where that decision stops being theoretical. Jinbe walks back into Big Mom's tea party in her own territory, with her crew, her homies, her surveillance weaponized to the wallpaper, and he puts the cup down. That sake bowl is literally his contract. Protection for Fishman Island in exchange for his obedience. Returning it is not just quitting a job, it's tearing up the last safety net for his people, out loud, in front of a Yonko whose power is fear. And then he says the thing you're not supposed to say in One Piece politics, I am your captain's man. Listen to me. For Jinbe, that is rock bottom and breakthrough at the same time. This is the man who compromised with the world government as a Shichibukai, who compromised with Big Mom to keep Fishman Island from being erased, who has spent his entire story treating his own ideals like a luxury item he can't afford. The worst version of Jinbe is the one who keeps swallowing his pride because the alternative is his people dying. On Whole Cake, he finally flips it. He risks his people's safety, not for a bargain he hates, but for a future he actually believes in. And Oda has been seeding that pivot since Marineford. Remember Jinbe grabbing Luffy in the aftermath, when Luffy is broken enough to say being Pirate King doesn't matter anymore. Jinbe doesn't give him some abstract "the sea will test you" speech. He says, "You still have your crew." He literally reframes Luffy's dream from crown to connections. When you line those panels up with Whole Cake, you realize Jinbe has been practicing this belief, people over systems, longer than anyone on that ship. That's why his role on the Sunny matters. Helmsman isn't just guy who turns the wheel. Jinbe is the one who reads currents, steers through impossible weather, and functionally keeps the Thousand Sunny from being pulverized every time Oda throws a new ancient weapon-adjacent tsunami at them. But he's also the elder in the room. In Wano, in Onigashima, in every high-stakes situation, he's the one calmly asking, what are we actually gambling here, lives or pride? He's steering the moral compass as much as the keel. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. We love to talk about Jinbe as the reliable adult, like he just spawned in that way. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. His strength comes from his ugliest compromises. He knows exactly what it costs to serve the wrong masters, to call a tyrant protector, because the sea is worse. So when he chooses Luffy, it's not naive faith. It's informed consent to follow the most dangerous system he's ever seen. A captain who might one day hold something scarier than a Yonko's territory. The power to rewrite the world itself. And that raises a harder question we're not ready for yet. If Jinbe is willing to ride out that storm, what does that say about the storms Luffy is actually heading toward? Pattern check. Every Straw Hat's worst moment follows the same script. So when Jinbe signs up for ride or die with the world's most dangerous himbo, you have to ask, what is he actually seeing? Because it's not just Luffy's punches. It's a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the thing. Every Straw Hat has the same 3-beat script. First, there's a core wound, some ancient little lie about themselves. I'm a monster. I'm useless. I'm only worth anything if I disappear. Then they run a coping strategy into the ground for years. Strength, jokes, cooking, lies, whatever. Finally, Oda walks them to a moment where that strategy catastrophically fails and they have to pick one of two doors. Isolate harder, or let the crew in. Luffy hits Marineford and Sabaody and realizes, if I just punch harder, my friends still die. That's his failure of raw willpower. Zoro throws himself at Mihawk, gets humiliated, and learns that pride without backup is just a death wish. Nami surrenders everything to Arlong. Robin literally chooses death at Enies' lobby. Sanji self-exiles in Whole Cake. All three are running the same program. I will solve this alone, even if it kills me. Usopp rebels at Water 7 because his worth is tied to the going merry. When that breaks, he breaks. Chopper leans into being a monster until Enies' lobby forces him to see that going berserk without trust just scares the people he's trying to save. Franky's guilt over Tom turns into this hyper-controlling shipwright persona, but he still can't stop the puffing Tom. Brook is the purest version. Isolation as lifestyle. 50 years of it. Jinbe compromises with the world government and Big Mom, convinced that quiet deals will protect his people, until they don't. When you line those panels up, it's the same shape. Old strategy fails. Self-hatred spikes. Then Luffy or the crew crash the scene and basically say, okay, you're wrong about yourself and also you're stuck with us now. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You have read at least one of those arcs as oh cool power-up time and skimmed past the fact that Oda is doing character surgery. Because Oda doesn't throw their worst beliefs away. He recycles them. Luffy's helplessness turns into a new leadership style. Train, delegate, trust. Zoro's humiliation becomes the spine of a right hand who will literally say, "Nothing happened," and bear the pain silently. Nami's surrender becomes the cartographer who never lets anyone sail blind again. Robin's death wish becomes the historian who will not let the void century repeat. Sanji's self-exile mutates into the cook who feeds everyone, including himself, like they deserve to live. Stack that across the crew and the Sunny stops being a ship. It's an ecosystem of 10 different rock bottoms, engineered so no one person has to be invincible, because their specific failure is covered by someone else's recovery. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that doesn't feed directly into the Pirate King question. If the crew is literally built out of weaponized vulnerability, what does that say about the guy who's eventually going to stand in front of a real ancient weapon system and decide what the world looks like after? Why Oda loves to break his characters first, and what it does to us. So why does this keep happening? Why does every Straw Hat have to be emotionally waterboarded before Oda lets them be cool again? Because he likes it. Like, explicitly. Oda has said he enjoys drawing characters at their lowest first, then showing how they climb back up. That's not a throwaway comment. That's a design philosophy. When you line those panels up, Luffy screaming over Ace's body, Nami stabbing her own shoulder, Robin in chains whispering that she wants to live, you're seeing the rule, not the exception. Here's the thing. Most series start with, "This guy is awesome, watch him win." One Piece starts with, "This guy is a mess, watch him decide to keep going." That's a completely different emotional contract. You don't just admire Zoro because he cut steel. You remember him on his knees at Barati, sword broken, admitting he'll never lose again after getting humiliated by Mihawk. You don't just cheer for Sanji's kicks. You watched him sob on the deck in whole cake, convinced he doesn't deserve to go home. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You don't connect to these people because they're strong. You connect because their worst moments look uncomfortably like yours. Luffy after Marineford, staring at his bandaged chest, saying he couldn't protect a single one of them? That's not pirate fantasy. That's the night you realized effort isn't the same as outcome. Usopp screaming that he's useless, Chopper calling himself a monster, Brook playing alone in a ruined ship for decades. These are not "oops, I lost a fight" setbacks. These are identity collapses. Psychologically, that's doing two things to you at once. First, it makes every later win feel earned instead of handed out. When Robin stands on the bridge of Enies' lobby and declares she wants to live, you feel 20 years of persecution, bounties, and burning history books snap in half. When Jinbe, drowning in survivor's guilt from Fisher, Tiger, and Whitebeard, still chooses to kneel and offer his blood to Luffy, the future alliance isn't just convenient, it's paid for in advance. Second, it quietly rewires what you think strength even is. In a pure power fantasy, failure is a coffee break. You lose, you train, you glow, you win. In One Piece, failure is a thesis defense on your entire existence. Are you still Sniper King after you abandon the crew? Are you still world's greatest swordsman material after you admit you were nothing before your captain? Oda keeps making them answer yes, but only after they've stared down the no. And I say that with love. When fans talk about One Piece like it's just a fun treasure hunt, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. The series lasts this long because the emotional scaffolding is heavier than the plot. We're not just waiting to see if Luffy finds some ancient weapon vault or becomes Pirate King. We're watching to see if these broken people can actually stay on the same ship long enough to reach the decision point. So if Oda keeps breaking them before every climb, we need to talk about what that says about the final climb, the last, worst moment he's clearly saving for Luffy. The Sunny as group therapy, how their traumas interlock. So if Oda keeps breaking them before every climb, we also have to admit something slightly uncomfortable. The Sunny is basically a floating group therapy room with cannons. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second, Because once you see how their worst moments interlock, you can't go back to "they're just a fun pirate crew" without it feeling like a lie. Start with Luffy and Nami. Luffy's trauma is failure. Sabaody and Marineford hard reset his brain into "I will throw my body at the problem before I ever watch my crew vanish again." Nami's trauma is loss through risk. Arlong Park burned into her that one bad gamble cost your entire village. So when they stand over a map, his instinct is charge, hers is freeze. But on the Sunny, that tension is the safety system. Luffy forces her to move when her Arlong panic would make her over-control everything. She forces him to think when his Marineford guilt would make him suicidal with confidence. Then you get Zoro and Usopp, which is Oda doing emotional load balancing. Zoro's whole deal after Baratie and Thriller Bark is, "Give me the weight, I'll carry it, I won't tell anyone." Usopp's whole deal after Syrup Village and Water 7 is, "I'm terrified, I'm going to say it out loud, repeatedly, with tears and snot." One is silent burden, one is vocal fear. Listen to me, that's not a joke dynamic, that's a design. Zoro stops the crew from collapsing under named fears by just doing the impossible thing. Usopp stops Zoro from walking straight into a Mihawk 2.0 situation by screaming every possible failure state into the air until someone adjusts the plan. Robin and Chopper are the intellectual version of that. Robin has literally read the Void Century receipts. Her lowest point is being punished as a child for knowing the ancient crime. Chopper's lowest point is being a monster no one wants to treat. Put them together, and you get this terrifyingly precise empathy engine. She can see where the world's systemic wounds came from. He can't walk past a single one without trying to heal it. Here's the thing, when you line those panels up, Robin tracing poneglyphs, Chopper crying over a random villager, they're practicing for a future where the crew might actually touch the One Piece weapon system and have to decide whether to cauterize or cure. Franky and Brook are the ship's heartbeat. Franky's trauma is a train and a broken home. Brook's is an empty ship singing to no one. So of course they obsess over keeping the Sunny loud, crowded, ridiculous. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend their concerts and upgrades aren't them screaming "never again" at the idea of another ghost crew. And then there's Jinbe, the living warning label. His worst mistakes are allegiance mistakes: Arlong, Fisher Tiger, Whitebeard, Big Mom, the world government. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is meaner than all of us. He takes that guilt and installs Jinbe as the guy who will side-eye every alliance Luffy tries to make. He's the one who hears temporary truce and remembers slavery contracts. He's there so that when the final deal shows up, the world-scale choice Roger walked away from, someone on deck is asking, "Who gets crushed this time if we say yes?" So if the Sunny is already running this emotional fail-safe network at sea, what happens when you plug that system into Laugh Tale itself? Captaincy reframed. Luffy isn't the strongest, he's the safest to break around. You plug that into Laugh Tale, and suddenly, who gets crushed this time? Stops being a metaphor and becomes a literal design question. And this is where we need to talk about Luffy's actual job on that ship, because it is not strongest guy who punches the weapon the hardest. Here's the thing. Every Straw Hat's worst moment either happens because of Luffy or directly in front of him, and Oda keeps showing you the same response. Not disgust, not distance, not, "Wow, you're pathetic, get off my crew." You get acceptance so absolute, it's almost unnerving. When you line those panels up, it looks less like a captain giving orders, and more like a gravity well quietly saying, "You can fall apart here and nothing breaks." Nami clawing her arm bloody in Arlong Park. Luffy doesn't give a speech about perseverance. He puts the hat on her. That's his treasure, his one piece of identity, and he hangs it on the neck of a woman at her ugliest, messiest breakdown. Robin at Enies' lobby, literally screaming that she wants to live after 20 years of being treated as a walking Void Century crime. He doesn't ask for proof she won't betray them. He just roars back, "Let's go!" and rewrites her entire relationship to her own existence in one panel. Sanji in whole cake, lying in the rain, face swollen, telling Luffy to leave. Luffy stays, starves, says he won't eat food from anyone but Sanji, and I need you to be very honest with me for a second. That is not a tactical decision. That is a man deliberately being useless in a fight so that someone else is allowed to be useless as a person. Usopp at Water 7 breaks the ship, breaks their trust, breaks Luffy's face. Luffy still leaves the door open. Of course I want you back. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that's just shonen forgiveness spam. Chopper's monster point. Everyone else sees a weapon out of control. Luffy sees his doctor and says, "Don't worry, I'll handle it," and then proceeds to trust him again anyway. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is meaner than both of us. I'm telling you, these aren't random wholesome beats. This is a system. Luffy is not a commander in the marine sense. He's a gravitational center. Broken people orbit him because he is the safest person in the story to break in front of. That's why Zoro, Mr. I'll carry hell quietly, picks him. That's why someone like Jinbe, who has served more captains than we have functioning brain cells, looks at this disaster rubber man and says, yeah, that flag. Jinbe has seen strong. He's seen strategic. What he hasn't seen is a captain who knows exactly what to do with failure. Listen to me. The real qualification for Pirate King might not be, can you conquer the seas? But can you be the one place in the world where everyone else is allowed to collapse without being discarded? And if that's the job description, then what happens when you hand that kind of captain the trigger to an ancient system built to collapse continents? Your favorite hype moments are built on scenes you skip. And here's where I have to be annoying and talk about you, because you love that captain who lets everyone collapse without being discarded. But you keep watching his story like a TikTok compilation. Be honest, how many times have you rewatched Gear 5's first entrance? Zoro's Asura against Kaku, Sanji lighting up Diable Jambe, Robin screaming, "I want to live." And how many times have you willingly gone back to the scenes where those same people are pathetic, broken, or begging? I need you to be very honest with me for a second, because I do this too. You scrub to the punchline and skip the setup. You'll run Marineford back 10 times for Whitebeard's Quake and Luffy's desperate charge, but you won't pair it with Amazon Lily and that post-war forest where he's sobbing, punching trees, saying he couldn't protect a single one of them. You love the war. You skip the grief. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. You'll spam Enies lobby reaction clips for the flag burning and "I want to live." But you don't sit with Water 7 Luffy screaming at Usopp on that bridge, or Robin calmly choosing death because she believes she's a cursed piece of void century history. When you line those panels up, that tower walk becomes unbearable in the best way. It's not just hype. It's a woman changing a decision she made when she was 8 years old. You cheer for Arlong Park's walk and that final "Luffy, help me," but you rarely go back to Nami as a kid, drawing maps with blood on her hands under Arlong's boot. You eat up Whole Cake's wedding crash, but do you re-watch Barati Sanji groveling to Zeph's guests, being told he's worthless, absorbing that into his bones so hard that years later he'll walk away from Luffy rather than risk being chosen? Here's the thing. If you don't pair those arcs, Marineford with Amazon Lily, Water 7 with Enies Lobby, Arlong Park with the earliest Nami flashbacks, Whole Cake with Barati, you're flattening what Oda actually built. Because the emotional weight of Gear 5 is not, wow, new form. It's, this idiot who failed at Sabaody and Marineford and watched his brother die is still choosing to laugh in the face of a world-scale weapon system. Asura isn't just a cool aura. It's the guy who got humiliated by Mihawk at Barati, deciding he will never lose again, and then quietly cashing the check. So let me push you a little. If you only want the peaks without the valleys, are you really engaging with One Piece? Or are you just using it as a highlight reel to spike your brain chemistry for 22 minutes? Not because I'm smarter than you, but because I've literally done this. And it broke how I read the story. Listen to me. Go to the comments and confess. Which worst moment have you avoided revisiting and why? Turn the comments section into a mini group therapy session. Say, I skip post Marineford Luffy, or I can't watch Sanji on Barity, and actually name the scene. Because once we admit what we're skipping, we can finally talk about what Oda is really doing with those breakdowns. Counter-argument time. Can't we just enjoy the wins? Because here's the pushback, right? You hear, confess your skip scenes, and your whole brain goes, or, and hear me out, I could just enjoy the funny rubber pirate show and not turn it into a group dissertation on trauma. And listen to me, that instinct is not wrong. Sometimes you've had a long day, your boss is a world government allegory, your commute feels like Impel Down, and you just want Luffy punching a celestial dragon, Zoro getting lost in a hallway, and Brook making the same skull joke for the 400th time. Comfort media is real. Using One Piece as a warm blanket is real. I do it too. I'm not watching Drum Island every time I need a snack. But here's the thing, One Piece itself refuses to be pure comfort. Oda keeps dragging us back to genocide, slavery, and grief, like a parent gently turning your head toward the news. You can try to treat Sabadi like, wow, supernovas, cool designs, but 2 minutes later there's a Fishman child on an auction block. You can meme, I want to live, into a reaction image, but that line is built on an ancient genocide and a child hunted for reading history. This story is literally about a world built on mass graves and a weaponized past. When you ignore the worst moments, you're not just protecting your feelings, you're flattening Oda's writing. 25 plus years of setup collapse into a highlight reel of W's. Marineford becomes Luffy's epic war arc, instead of the moment he realizes he couldn't protect a single one of them. Whole Cake Island turns into Sanji's cool sky walk sequences. Instead of the time his self-worth was so broken, he tried to starve himself off the ship. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. And I say that with love, not because I am smarter than you, but because when you line those panels up, the breakdowns, the begging, the ugly crying, you see what Oda is actually doing. The joy is not a distraction from the pain. The joy is framed as rebellion against it. Luffy laughing in the shadow of Marineford's graves, Brook dancing after losing his entire crew, Jinbe calmly offering blood in a world built on racialized fear. That's not escapism, that's defiance. So no, paying attention to breakdowns doesn't kill the vibe. It explains why the vibe is so intense, why the party on the Sunny hits harder when you remember Robin's execution stand or Usopp on his knees in Water 7. The Straw Hat's strength is not that they dodge pain, it's that they metabolize it together. If we skip that, we're not watching One Piece. We're watching a different, worse show we made up. And if you still think I'm overthinking it, we need to talk about what Oda himself has said he likes to draw first, the lowest point. Why these rock bottoms make the final war actually scary. So when Oda says he likes drawing the lowest point first, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. What do you think the final war actually looks like? You think it's just Gear 5 wallpapers and bounty number discourse? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Here's the thing. Those rock bottoms we just walked through are not isolated trauma episodes. They're prototypes. They're Oda running simulations on this crew, stress testing how they break, so that when the world finally catches fire over the Void Century and the ancient weapons, he knows exactly which fault lines to press. The final war isn't about whether Luffy can punch an admiral. It's about whether this ship can survive having all their worst fears triggered at once on a planetary scale. Marineford was Luffy's personal apocalypse, total helplessness, the weaponized spectacle of an execution, the system using one man's death as a message to the world. Now zoom that up. Imagine a Marineford where the execution is an entire island or an entire race. Live broadcast as deterrent while Uranus redraws the sky. Imagine Luffy hearing screams he physically cannot reach in time again. Except this time, He's the guy with the theoretical access to the control panel. Too late isn't just sad now, it's unforgivable. Enies' lobby was persecution as theatre. Robin branded a demon. The Straw Hats framed as terrorists for daring to read history. In the endgame, that doesn't stay local. You get a global Enies lobby, where every poneglyph, every scholar, every ally island that ever harbored this crew is labeled an enemy of humanity. When you line those panels up, from O'Hara's flames to the Buster call at Enies lobby to Lulusia getting erased, you can see Oda scaling the same horror. What happens when knowledge itself is treated as a weapon? And Whole Cake, that's family as a cage. Sanji's trauma is, I am only valuable if I erase myself. Now imagine the world government running that play on a global level. Bloodlines, D-carriers, fishmen, Lunarians, everyone forced into roles by ancient contracts and celestial dragons who literally own the map. You don't just threaten the Straw Hats' bodies, you threaten the chosen family logic that holds this absurd little ship together. Listen to me. We're not scared they'll lose the fight. We're scared they'll lose themselves. We've already seen Luffy post Marineford saying he shouldn't be Pirate King, Usopp in Water 7 deciding he's dead weight, Robin choosing annihilation over connection. The terror of the final war is that Oda might line those three emotional deaths up in the same week. And Oda knows that. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because when you actually track Arc Order, he keeps escalating the coping mechanisms. Zoro bearing unseen pain, Jinbe reframing Luffy's guilt, Brook and Chopper normalizing monstrosity as something you can still dance with. He's training them, and you, to recognize a breakdown and stay. Which leaves one uncomfortable question hanging over the endgame. Whose true worst moment hasn't happened yet? And what does that imply? Because if you think every Straw Hat has already hit bottom, we need to talk about the one crew member whose entire dream is literally wired into the world's final reset switch. Reader self-insert. Which Straw Hat's worst moment is yours? So let's turn that question back on you, because you're not getting out of this as a passive viewer. Which Straw Hat's worst moment is actually yours? And I need you to be very honest with me for a second, because this is not who's your favorite character discourse. This is not Zoro is cool and has swords tier analysis. I'm asking, when you watch these people break, whose coping mechanism feels uncomfortably familiar in your own body? Is it Luffy at Marineford screaming over Ace, then later muttering that he couldn't protect a single one of them? That instinct to fail once, catastrophically, and then decide you were never qualified for the dream in the first place? Or maybe it's Nami, shoulders shaking in the dirt, finally stabbing her own arm, because if she hurts herself first, Arlong can't take anything else from her. Self-sabotage as preemptive control. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial, because Oda is literally drawing you a mirror and you're calling it peak shonen hype. Here's the thing, a lot of you are Robin. You spend 20 years collecting forbidden history, convinced that simply existing with that knowledge makes you a weapon that will get everyone around you killed. So you pre-reject yourself. I want to live hits you like a truck, not because it's a cool Enies lobby moment, but because you have no idea how to say that sentence without apologizing. When you line those panels up with your own childhood, it gets uncomfortable very fast. Or your Sanji, the guy who self-exiles from his own crew twice, because abuse rewired his brain so thoroughly that love feels like a debt he can never repay. So he leaves before they can waste resources on him. Or your Usopp screaming at the going merry and at Luffy because if you admit you feel useless, the whole fragile story you built about your worth collapses. You call it cowardice. Oda calls it a thesis on inferiority complexes. Listen to me, fans don't latch onto these characters because of the drip or the memes or the bounty numbers. They latch on because their worst moment is a funhouse reflection of your own. Abuse, loneliness, feeling useless, being the responsible one who grew up too early. Oda weaponizes all of that under a coat of pirate clown paint. He's using treasure hunts, ancient weapons, and void century history to talk about the day you realized your family would not save you. And I say that with love. Your parasocial attachment is not cringe. It is the intended use case. The story is handing you patterns so you feel less alone. So in the comments, I want specifics. Not trauma dump manifestos, not full medical histories. Just, I'm a Robin, I'm a Sanji, I'm a pre-time skip Usopp. And maybe one line about the pattern you recognize. Frame it as recognition, not confession. Because once you found yourself in their worst moment, the next question is brutal. Are you actually willing to follow them through the recovery, or do you close the manga right there? Rewatch guide. How to track growth from each worst moment. So let's weaponize that discomfort. You found your straw hat mirror at rock bottom. Now, I want you to actually track what Oda does with that version of you, instead of just vibing with the pain and scrolling TikTok AMVs. Here's the thing. One Piece is long. Your brain will absolutely flatten it into pre-time skip versus post-time skip power-ups, unless you give it a scaffold. So I'm going to hand you one. Not because I am smarter than you, but because my brain is already broken in the extremely specific pause to check chapter numbers mid-cry way. Start with Luffy. Go Sabaody 510 to 513 for the crew's annihilation, then Marineford 488 to 490 and 574 to 580 for Ace dying and the breakdown, then the immediate aftermath in 581 to 597 with Rayleigh and Jinbe. On rewatch, don't just cry at the grave. Watch how his dialogue shifts from "I'll become Pirate King because I decided to" "I couldn't protect a single one of them" to "I still have my crew." Then jump to Fishman Island 617 to 626 and see how he leads differently when people's lives are on the line. Same stressor. Overwhelming war, ancient weapon adjacent stakes, new coping strategy. Zoro? Hit Barati 46 to 51 for Mihawk. Then Thriller Bark 483 to 489 for Nothing Happened. Then Sabaody again. Notice who he talks to. Early Zoro eats humiliation alone. Post Thriller Bark, Zoro starts quietly positioning himself as the wall between Luffy and the world. When you line those panels up, you see the burden of right hand of the future Pirate King crystallize way before rooftop battles. For Nami, do Arlong Park 31 to 33 and 37 to 41, then jump to Enies Lobby 398 to 403 and 416 to 421. Track how "I'll steal from you and fix it myself" mutates into "I'm asking you to help me live." Then watch her in Whole Cake and Wano backing Sanji and Robin. The girl who couldn't trust anyone becomes the one teaching other people how to lean on the crew. Robin is Water 7/Enies, Lobby 398 to 399, 403 to 405, 418 to 421. Sanji is Barati 48 to 52, then Whole Cake 812 to 825 and 843 to 855. Usopp is Water 7 329 to 335 and 360 to 362, then Sogeking at Enies Lobby and later Dressrosa sniping from the shadows. Chopper, Franky, Brook, Jinbe run their flashbacks, then their first big post-flashback choice under Luffy's flag. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you rewatch, do you actually pay attention to old coping versus new behavior? Or do you just wait for the big punch? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Take notes. Literally write, Usopp runs from conflict next to Water 7. Then Usopp snipes Sugar while shaking in Dressrosa. Circle where Oda pays off a breakdown hundreds of chapters later. And listen to me. This is how you make filler and slow arcs feel rich. You're not killing time until the next Void Century info dump. You're watching the crew practice being their new selves. This is how you survive the wait for new chapters. You stop begging for more treasure and start mining the story you already have. Because once you train your eye on those micro upgrades, the next question gets uncomfortable. What happens when those personal recoveries smash directly into the ancient kingdom's unfinished business? The hidden flex, the Straw Hats, are already living their worst-case scenarios. So here's the thing. You keep worrying about what the world is going to do to the Straw Hats in the final war, and you're missing the much uglier flex. The story has already done the worst to them. They are not waiting for their nightmares. They are sailing on the other side of them. Luffy's primal fear is being powerless while his friends die. Marineford is that fear rendered in ink. Ace in his arms, body failing, mind fracturing so hard he literally forgets his own dream. Sabaody is the beta test. Kuma erases his entire crew in front of him. That's Pirate King stripped down to a kid who couldn't protect a single one. He's not guessing what failure feels like. He has data. Zoro's fear is being useless when it matters most, failing the promise that built his whole identity. Barity gives you the humiliation. Mihawk carving him open while he shakes. Thriller Bark gives you the nightmare. Everyone down, nothing left. And he still volunteers to take all of Luffy's pain on top of his own. When you line those panels up, nothing happened is not stoicism. It's a guy who has already lived the moment where his body should have quit, and it didn't. Nami and Robin. Their worst fear is being abandoned as liabilities. Nami's entire Arlong Park childhood is people deciding she's a tool or a traitor. Robin spends 20 years internalizing that her existence gets islands erased. Enies' lobby is literally her choosing death because she believes staying is more dangerous than dying. The miracle isn't, I want to live. It's that after living that, she ever trusts a ship again. Sanji's fear is being controlled back into the cage he escaped from. Whole Cake is his nightmare in 4K. Hands chained, mouth muzzled, forced to kick the only man who ever treated him like a real human. Usopp and Chopper run the I am useless / I am a monster script on loop. Franky and Brook are carrying guilt for ships sunk and crews dead. Jinbe has already watched a captain die and a dream fail. Listen to me. This crew is a museum of worst-case scenarios that didn't kill them. And I say that with love. If you still read their partying as naivete, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. They're not laughing because they think the world is safe. They're laughing because they know it isn't, and they're still choosing joy. That's a post-trauma survival strategy, not Saturday morning optimism. Contrast that with a lot of villains and rivals. Doflamingo's whole identity shatters the second Dressrosa stops clapping. Akainu cannot even imagine being wrong. His justice breaks other people, not himself. Even Roger, for all his swagger, taps out at too early, rather than living through the consequences of pushing the ancient weapon system online. So the real endgame question stops being, who wins the big war, and shifts to, who can stay themselves when the Void Sentry's unfinished machine tries to break them again? Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda has been quietly stress testing that answer, crew member by crew member, while you were busy arguing about whether the One Piece is just treasure. And if the Straw Hats are already living post-apocalypse, then the next escalation isn't about new pain, it's about scale. What happens when a crew that has survived their personal hells walks into a weapon designed to rewrite the entire planet? Soft recap. What every Straw Hat's worst moment actually gave them. So let's zoom out for a second, because if you're still here, you've basically done emotional Marineford on yourself. When you line those panels up, every Straw Hat's worst moment is not just trauma porn, it's architecture. It's Oda stress testing exactly what kind of people you need standing on the deck of a world reset weapon. Luffy first. Sabaody and Marineford take his whole fantasy of, I punch hard, my friends don't die, and burn it down. He's helpless, Ace dies, and he actually says he's too weak to be Pirate King. That's the break. The rebuild is a captain who trains, who plans just enough, who trusts his crew to cover the angles he can't see. He doesn't become less reckless. He becomes a guy who knows he can fail and sails anyway. Zoro's humiliation by Mihawk and then nothing happened at Thriller Bark. do the same thing on the right-hand level. He gets annihilated, then silently eats Luffy's pain with no witnesses, no glory. That's the blueprint for a first mate whose job is to carry the invisible burdens. To be the one person on that ship who is allowed to be crushed so the captain doesn't have to be. Here's the thing. The same pattern runs through the rest of them. Nami's "I can't do it, help me" at Arlong Park turns a girl who only trusted maps and money into a navigator who lets other people hold the pen. Robin's death wish, 20 years of running from ancient history until "I want to live," forges a historian who actively chooses a future instead of just cataloguing the void century on her way to the grave. Sanji's self-exile with Bharati, then whole cake, is him weaponizing self-neglect. He will starve himself so others eat. His rock bottom is realizing he actually wants to be fed too, that he's allowed to sit at the table he cooks for. That's not just healing. That's the exact cook you want when the world is about to be remade, and people will have to believe they deserve that new world. Usopp breaks the loudest. He rebels, quits, snipes from the sidelines because he's terrified he's the weak link, and then he keeps moving while scared. That's his whole thing now, a sniper whose courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to fire anyway. Chopper's monstrosity is his core shame. He's the thing people point at. Oda flips it. He becomes a doctor who weaponizes that fear, who turns the monster into a scalpel aimed at the real disease. Franky's guilt over Tom and the sea train. That's how you get a shipwright who refuses to build weapons again, only homes. Thousand Sunny is not just a boat. It's his apology, made seaworthy. Brook's decades of isolation turn into a musician who refuses empty rooms, who fills silence with sound because he knows exactly what the void feels like. Jinbe's whole life of compromises, bouncing between empires and promises, crystallizes into a helmsman who picks his captain with terrifying intention and never swerves again. Listen to me. Their worst moments are not detours. They are the blueprints, line by line, for the precise crew you'd want, standing next to Luffy when he reaches the final control node. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda has been quietly telling you this for 25 years. So if this is the test run on a human scale, what happens when you hand this exact group the power to redraw the map? Why this matters more than any power scaling chart? Because here's the thing. Once you hand them that power, all your tier lists evaporate. Your Luffy versus X debates, your bounty spreadsheets, your lovingly color-coded power scaling charts. They have the shelf life of a weekly Shonen Jump issue. Fun in the moment, absolutely. But they don't stick to your ribs. What does stay with you is Luffy on the ground after Marineford, screaming that he couldn't protect a single one of them. Zoro on that cross at Bharati, promising Mihawk he'll never lose again while literally drowning in his own blood. Robin whispering that she wants to live after 20 years of the world, telling her she shouldn't have existed in its history. You remember those panels because they're emotional blueprints, not stat blocks. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you think about One Piece at 3 in the morning, are you actually thinking about Luffy is continental level? Or are you replaying him banging on that rock after Ace dies, begging for one more chance? You can win a who's stronger argument in a Discord server and feel amazing for 5 minutes. Then it's gone. But the first time you see Sanji on his knees in the rain at Whole Cake, choosing to starve his dream rather than let his found family die, that rewires something. Listen to me. Once the story ends, the power scaling becomes trivia. The emotional engineering remains. Oda has been building a reference manual for how to survive yourself and disguising it as a pirate adventure about a treasure and an ancient weapon system. When you line those panels up, from Usopp running away at Enies' lobby to Jinbe calmly offering his blood to a human on Fishman Island, you get a catalogue of failure responses. Panic, self-hatred, denial, bargaining, acceptance, and then something past acceptance, choosing to sail anyway. And I say that with love, because I do the same thing you do. I fall into the who beats who vortex to avoid asking why I feel sick when Chopper calls himself a monster. or why Franky sobbing over the going merry hits harder than any haki clash. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda is quietly using pirates to model what it looks like to confront the ugliest version of yourself, lose, and then decide that version doesn't get the final say. Here's the thing. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start watching other shows and you're not just tracking wins, you're tracking how people break. You notice who apologizes, who doubles down, who changes the ship's course after the storm. You start doing it in your own life. Okay, that was my Sabayodi. What's my Rayleigh training arc? So when we talk about every Straw Hat's worst moment, this isn't a detour from the real One Piece conversation. This is the conversation. And the final question isn't who's strongest? It's whether you're willing to keep reading your own story with the same ruthless compassion Oda gives his pirates. Which means, before we're done, we need to talk about your worst moment too, and how this crew might already be showing you what to do with it. Your turn. Which breakdown made you stronger as a fan? So let's flip this around, because you've been watching these pirates bleed for 10 sections, and you've been suspiciously quiet. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Which Straw Hat's worst moment actually changed how you saw them? And did it mess with how you saw yourself too? Don't give me the vague answer. Don't write Marineford hit hard and vanish. Be specific. Was it Luffy on his knees after Ace dies, screaming that he couldn't protect a single one of his friends, that made you realize this story was not just Rubber Man wins funny fights, but a piece about what you do when your dream and your body both fail you at the same time? Did that make you rethink what being the main character of your own life actually costs? Or was it Enies' lobby? Robin on the bridge, the Buster call behind her, 20 years of Void Century history hunting her down, and she finally breaks and says, "I want to live." Did that line make you cry for Robin? Or did it make you look at the parts of yourself you've been treating like a crime just for existing? Listen to me. When you line those panels up with your own timeline, whose voice do you actually hear? Whole Cake Island people, where are you? Did Sanji on his knees in the rain, begging Luffy to leave, make you angrier at Sanji for betraying the crew? Or did you end up furious at Judge, at Zeph's hostage situation, at the way abuse rewires your idea of what you're allowed to want? Did that arc quietly make you more patient with your own self-sabotage? Here's the thing. If you think I picked the wrong rock bottom for any of them, I want you to fight me in the comments, and I say that with love. If you think Zoro's real lowest point isn't Thriller Bark Nothing Happened, but Baratie kneeling in front of Mihawk with his dream shattered, lay it out. Panels, chapters, episodes. If you think Usopp's real break is not Water 7 but Sabayodi, make the case. And don't just talk at me, talk to each other. If someone drops a Marineford essay, reply with your whole cake reading. If someone argues Jinbe's real collapse is his flashback with Fisher Tiger, add Brook's decades of isolation to that thread. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend your read is the only one that works. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because this channel works way better when the comment section turns into a layered analysis instead of 500 variations of W video. I'm absolutely reading the arguments, the timestamps, the ancient screenshots you dig up. Future videos on Luffy's final decision, on the weapon nature of the One Piece, on how Roger frames too early might be built directly off what you drop here. You are not just viewers, you're co-authors of this breakdown. So which breakdown made you stronger as a fan? Answer that, and then we need to talk about what Oda is actually training you for with all this. Next voyage. Do we break down? Every Luffy failure or every crew sacrifice? Because if you're still here after watching your favorite pirates emotionally disintegrate in HD, you're not just doom-scrolling panels, you're training your brain with Oda's worst-case scenarios. So here's the thing, we're not done. We just decided which door you walked through first. Next voyage, you get to pick the next descent. Do we go full masochist and track every single time Luffy fails, chokes, or straight up breaks, and then map exactly what changes in the story after each one? Or do we build a dossier of every unseen, uncredited, underappreciated Straw Hat sacrifice that the crew, and honestly most of the fandom, never fully clocks? Think about the Luffy route for a second. Sabodi, where he can't save a single Nakama and the story literally rips them out of the panel. Marineford, Ace dying in his arms while he admits he couldn't protect anyone. Post-war, where he actually says being Pirate King doesn't matter if he can't keep his friends alive. Oda has said he likes drawing characters at their lowest first. Luffy is basically a catalogue of controlled crashes. When you line those panels up, what pattern is Oda hammering into your skull about leadership, about power, about this ancient weapon system he's steering toward? Now zoom out to the crew sacrifice route. Zoro at Barati getting carved up by Mihawk, then nothing happened at Thriller Bark while everyone else sleeps. Robin's 20 years of being hunted for knowing void century history, compressed into I want to live. Sanji walking away from the Sunny twice, because his self-worth is that broken. Jinbe and Brook hauling around survivor's guilt and still choosing Luffy's flag. How many of those moments are invisible in universe, but absolutely define how this ship stays afloat? I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Which of those hurts you more? Put it in the comments. Literally vote. Team Luffy failures or Team Hidden Sacrifices. You pick the next deep dive. Not because I am smarter than you, but because this channel only works if we're obsessing in the same direction. And while you're down there arguing with strangers in paragraph form, like the video, subscribe, hit whatever bell YouTube has turned into a void century weapon this week. Share it if you're tired of surface level One Piece takes that stop at Hakigo Brar. This is for people who enjoy overthinking a fictional pirate until it feels like homework. Also, do community service. Send this to that friend who only talks about bounties and power levels. You know exactly who I mean. This is a gentle intervention. Touch story. Not just numbers. And I say that with love. So next time someone tells you the Straw Hats are so strong, I want you to challenge them. Ask, okay, but have you seen them at their worst? Then keep watching this series with that lens, because Oda is not just building legends, he's showing you how they break. So when Luffy finally stands in front of the real One Piece, treasure, weapon, system, whatever, you'll understand exactly what that choice cost him.